Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I've lost track of time. My watch stopped working. Who knows how long ago, and without it, everything feels blurry. I've been stuck in this elevator forever, or at least, that's what it feels like. Days, weeks, I can't even tell anymore. It's like time doesn't exist in here. Every minute drags on in this weird, endless loop, and I'm losing my mind. I work at a call center. For years, I've taken the elevator to the office without a second thought. But today, everything went wrong. I was late for work, rushing to catch the elevator like I always do. The usual one was out of service, so I had no choice but to use the old, broken one, the one that's always been blocked off with caution tape. Today, the tape was gone. I didn't think twice. I just wanted to get to work. I swiped my keycard, and the elevator doors creaked open, groaning like they hadn't moved in years. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I stepped inside. The moment the doors shut, I knew something was wrong. The lights flickered, buzzing overhead like they were struggling to stay on. Gravity felt weird, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I glanced at my watch. It was going crazy, the hands spinning so fast they blurred. Then, out of nowhere, the elevator dropped. It was like free-falling, like the bottom had fallen out, and I thought for sure I was going to die. But it stopped just as fast, leaving me standing there, breathless and terrified. I checked my phone. It was fully charged, even though I remember it being nearly dead when I got in. Weird, right? The elevator jerked upward, but it didn't stop. It kept moving up and down, over and over. Every time it went up, my watch spun faster, and when it dropped, my phone would somehow recharge to full. Even stranger, the water bottle I had, it refilled itself. The cookie in my bag, it would reappear untouched, like I hadn't eaten it. The air in here is thick, heavy, like it's slowly choking me. I'm having difficulty breathing, and the silence. It's not just quiet, it's wrong. I can hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, and every once in a while, there's this metallic screech, like something dragging sharp claws against the walls. I've tried everything to get out, banging on the walls until my hands bled, screaming at the top of my lungs. But nothing works. The sound just echoes back, like the elevator is mocking me. The emergency button, it's useless. It doesn't even click. I've tried forcing the doors open with my bare hands, but they won't budge. Not even a little dot. My phone, useless. Every time I try to message someone, the signal drops, and my message disappears before I can hit send. It's like I never typed it. But I am still trying, still hoping someone will see this dot. I hear whispers, faint, just on the edge of hearing. They sound close, like someone's standing right behind me. But when I turn around, there's nothing. Nothing but me and the shadows. And then I started seeing it. At first, it was just a feeling. That prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like you're being watched. Then I saw them. I think the long black shadows creeping along the walls. They move slow, like they're waiting, watching, getting closer each time the elevator jerks. Sometimes I swear I see hands twisted and bony reaching for me from the dark. I try to shake it off. Am I going crazy? I don't know. I've lost all sense of time, but I know it's real. Something is in here with me. It's getting harder to think, harder to stay awake. My body feels heavy, like the elevator is sucking the life out of me. My heart, it's slowing down. I can feel it. I can hear it, this deep, aching pressure in my chest. I'm fading, becoming weaker by the second. Please help me. And the shadows, they're closing in. I can see them now, sliding along the walls, fingers stretching out toward me. They want me. I don't know how much longer I can last. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers louder, feel the shadows creeping closer. I can't stay here, please. If anyone is reading this, help me. I am begging you, please, before it's too late. Before they take me, I can't hold on much longer. I was 14 when my parents sent me to stay with Aunt Meredith and Uncle Cole in Pennsylvania. I was excited for a change of scenery, eager to spend a few weeks with my cousins, Sarah and Ethan, in their quiet little town. Their neighborhood was charming, one of those picture-perfect cul-de-sacs with neatly manicured lawns, kids playing outside until dusk, and an ice cream truck that made its rounds like clockwork. It felt like an escape from the monotony of home, a place where nothing bad could ever happen. Sarah and Ethan were just a couple of years younger than me, but they had boundless energy and an uncanny ability to find trouble. Almost immediately, they introduced me to boys from the neighborhood, Henry and Jacob. Jacob was 16, tall, with a mischievous grin that suggested he was always on the verge of causing some kind of chaos. Most of our days were spent exploring the woods of Kimber Hills at the edge of the neighborhood. The forest felt alive, as though each shadow hid a secret and every rustling leaf was a mystery waiting to be uncovered. It was exhilarating, the kind of adventure that made me feel alive. But one afternoon, as we were about to head out for another exploration, an older woman from the last house on the street called out to us. She had a warm, kind face framed by silver-streaked hair, which was pulled into a neat bun. From her porch, she waved us over. "You kids can go anywhere you want," she said, her voice light but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "But stay away from Puckett Street." We all stopped in our tracks, puzzled by the seriousness of her tone. Sarah gave me a confused glance, and I couldn't help but ask, "What's Puckett Street?" The woman's smile faded, and her eyes darkened. "Just trust me, dear," she said, her voice firm. "You don't want to go there." That night at dinner, I mentioned the strange warning. Uncle Cole, who was usually full of jokes, stiffened immediately. He set his fork down with a sharp clink, his brow furrowing as he stared at me with an intensity I wasn't used to. "You didn't go there, did you?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I quickly shook my head. "No, we didn't. I was just curious. Who lives there?" Aunt Meredith, sitting quietly beside him, glanced at her husband nervously before answering. "Mr. Stimble lives on Puckett Street," she said softly. "He's not a nice man. He keeps to himself, and it's better that way." Uncle Cole leaned in, his voice stern. "You listen to me, and you listen good," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "Stay away from Puckett Street. No one goes there, ever." The chill in his voice sent a shiver down my spine, and I nodded, too afraid to ask anything more. The subject was dropped, and we moved on, but the warning stuck with me, knowing at the back of my mind. For a few days, we avoided the topic. We stuck to our usual trails, trying to forget about the mysterious street, but Jacob couldn't let it go. He kept bringing it up, teasing us about being too scared to check it out, egging us on in the way that older kids do when they're trying to prove something. One hot afternoon, after hours of wandering around the woods, Jacob tossed a rock into the creek and grinned at us. "What do you think is so bad about Puckett Street?" he challenged. "Maybe they're hiding something. Or maybe Mr. Stimble's just some grumpy old guy. Either way, I want to find out. Ethan hesitated, looking around nervously. Maybe there's a reason everyone says to stay away, he muttered, but Jacob wasn't backing down. Come on, he urged, that same sly grin on his face. Aren't you curious? Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. Just a quick look, I whispered, more to reassure myself than anything. Then we leave. The four of us made our way deeper into Kemper Hills, the trees growing thicker and the path narrowing, until we found it an old wooden fence, barely visible through the ivy and underbrush. Beyond it, Puckett Street stretched out like a forgotten road. The house sat at the far end of the street, a small, unassuming structure with cream-colored siding and faded purple shutters. It looked almost normal, but something about it felt off. The lawn was eerily perfect. The rocking chair on the porch swayed ever so slightly, even though the air was still. Jacob scoffed. See, just a house, he said. Nothing special, but everything about it felt wrong. The silence, the stillness, it all pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. Before any of us could protest, Jacob darted across the street, grinning like a madman. I'm going to knock, he called back, his voice full of reckless excitement. We watched, frozen, as he knocked once, twice. There was no answer. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, the door creaked open. A massive figure appeared in the doorway, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to fill the entire frame. Without warning, a hand shot out, grabbing Jacob by the collar and yanking him inside. The door slammed shut, cutting off his scream as quickly as it had begun. Panic hit us like a tidal wave. Henry was the first to react, pushing me and Sarah toward the trees. Run, he hissed, and we took off, crashing through the underbrush, not stopping until we reached my aunt and uncle's house. Breathless and terrified, we spilled the whole story to Aunt Meredith and Uncle Cole. I had never seen Uncle Cole so pale. He grabbed a pistol from the drawer and stormed out of the house without a word. Aunt Meredith, her hands shaking, dialed 911. The hours that followed were agonizing. The sun set, casting long shadows across the walls, and the house grew unbearably quiet. Henry's mom came to get him, leaving just me and Aunt Meredith sitting in terrified silence. When Uncle Cole finally returned, he looked like a man who had seen something no one should ever see. His clothes were dirty and soaked with sweat, and his eyes were wide and haunted. The police broke down the door, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They heard screaming and awful, inhuman sound. They found Jacob, or what was left of him, pieces, scattered everywhere. Aunt Meredith gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt my blood run cold. Did Mr. Stimble? I couldn't even finish the sentence. Uncle Cole shook his head, his face ashen. It wasn't him, he whispered, his voice trembling. There was something in that house, something that wasn't human. The officers said it looked like a demon, skeletal with eyes like burning coals. They shot Mr. Stimble, but whatever that thing was, it's still in there. And now, without anyone to control it, it's free. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Aunt Meredith put me on the first bus home. They moved shortly after, leaving everything behind. If you ever find yourself in northern Pennsylvania and see a house with cream-colored siding and faded purple shutters, keep driving. Don't stop. Whatever's in that attic is still waiting, and it's hungry. Let me start by saying that I'm a content creator. I won't disclose my identity for obvious reasons, but I run a true crime YouTube channel. It's not the biggest channel out there, but I've steadily built a solid following. My most recent videos have started to hit over 1 million views regularly, which feels insane to me. I'm beyond grateful for the support and attention. It's something I love doing, but I can't lie, it's nerve-wracking. I research and discuss some of the darkest corners of human behavior, and despite that, I am easily frightened. It's an irony I'm fully aware of. A person who delves into grisly details, crimes, and horrifying events gets jumpy at the slightest nudge. That's who I've always been. A little skittish, always quick to startle. If there's a creak in the house, I'm the first to get tense, imagining all kinds of terrifying scenarios. For someone who spends their time deep diving into creepy stories, it's probably not the most ideal personality trait, but it's how I am. I accepted that about myself long ago. I've come to realize recently that my instincts, that creeping sense of dread I often feel, might be more than just paranoia. They might be a warning. And when I look back at what's happened over the past year, I can't help but wonder if I should have trusted my gut from the start. It all started about a year ago, and my channel was growing, but hadn't quite hit the 1 million view mark yet. I'd been posting regularly, doing deep dives into various true crime cases, when one day something unexpected happened. It wasn't the usual absurd comment from a troll or spam bot. It wasn't even the occasional off-the-wall remark about how someone was saving a spot in their basement for me. This one was different, chilling in a way that's hard to describe. I was scrolling through the comments section of a new video, just doing what I usually do, engaging with the community, responding to fans, and skimming through the nonsense. But this one comment stopped me cold. It wasn't long. It didn't have the usual insults or even a twisted joke. No, it was just my home address. There it was, plain as day. My full address, out in the open, posted for anyone to see. My heart skipped a beat, and my hands started shaking as I deleted the comment as fast as I could. The panic set in immediately. How many people had seen it? Could someone have screenshotted it? I had caught it quickly, but this was the internet. Things like this can spread in an instant. The damage could already be done. I sat there for a few moments, staring at the screen, trying to process what had just happened. This was my worst fear realized. As a content creator, I always knew there was a risk of someone finding out my personal information. I had taken every precaution, using a P.O. box, being careful about what I shared online, but still, there it was. My privacy shattered. After I composed myself, I started digging into the account that had posted the comment. The username was Your Own Personality Taff. It was an account with no profile picture, no videos, no banner, just a blank slate of a profile. It was old, though, well over a decade, and that struck me as odd. Most trolls are using new accounts, throwaways, but this one had been around for years. I looked deeper, and that's when I noticed something else. There was one public playlist on the account. The playlist was simply titled Sleep, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped. Every video in that playlist was related to me. It was hundreds of videos, including all my content and any podcast, live stream, or interview I'd been a part of. There were even fan edits and videos where I was mentioned in passing. The playlist was obsessively comprehensive. I had fans who enjoy my work, sure, and I even had a few who told me they fall asleep to my videos. But this was on a whole other level. I scrolled and scrolled, but the videos just kept going. The list seemed endless, 2,000 videos, maybe more, all featuring me. It was unsettling. My throat felt dry, and my palms were sweating as I realized that someone had meticulously cataloged every public appearance I'd ever made. I couldn't explain it. Was this person a fan? A stalker? Was it the same person who posted my address? The more I thought about it, the worse it seemed. Why would someone go to such lengths? The feeling of being watched crept over me, like there were eyes on me even though I was alone in my house. My breathing became shallow, and the room started to feel smaller. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. I debated whether or not to contact the police. After all, what could they really do about a comment that had already been deleted? Still, I figured it was better to report it, just in case. I made the call, explaining the situation to the officer who answered. She was sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. Without the comment still being visible, she said there wasn't much they could do. She did say she'd pass it along to a detective, though, and they'd look into it. It wasn't much, but it was something. I hung up, hoping that this was the end of it. Maybe the person would lose interest. Maybe they'd get bored and move on. I could go back to work, focus on making content, and everything would go back to normal. But it didn't. A few days later, the detective called me back. He told me that when they tried to look up the account, it was gone, deleted just like that. No trace of your own personality existed anymore. The channel had vanished. It was like they had never been there at all. The detective was polite but dismissive. He told me that people often delete their account after posting something like that. He assured me it was probably a troll who was just looking to scare me and had no real intentions of causing harm. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was just some internet creep, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The playlist, the address, the complete disappearance of the account, it all felt deliberate. I saved it. But as the days passed with no new incidents, I started to convince myself that he was right. Maybe it was just a random troll, and maybe it was over. For months, things seemed to settle. I hired a moderator to help with the comments on my channel, and they did a great job of keeping things clean. I didn't see anything else concerning, and I allowed myself to believe that it was over. Life moved on. My channel continued to grow, and I even felt comfortable enough to leave the house for some trips, including a memorable visit to Yosemite National Park with my wife. It was a peaceful getaway, far removed from the stress of work and internet weirdness. But just when I thought I could finally breathe, something else happened. A few weeks ago, after returning from a trip and publishing a new video, I was going through my business emails. It was part of my routine, at this point sifting through sponsorship requests, offers from brands, and general inquiries. I got so many of these emails that they all started to blur together after a while. But one email caught my eye. The subject line read, "Can I count on your support?" At first glance, it looked like a standard sponsorship request, so I clicked on it without thinking. But when I opened it, the email wasn't what I expected. It started with a typical greeting, addressing me by name and introducing what appeared to be a sponsorship opportunity with the Yosemite Parks network. But then, halfway through, the email changed tone completely. "Please tell me you remember me." I'm not going to talk about my wife's name. I'm going to keep her out of it. I promise. Tell me you remember me. You need new camera. I've been watching, so I know that was it. The email cut off abruptly with no signature, no explanation. Just that cryptic message. My heart was pounding as I stared at the screen. How did they know my wife's name? I'd mentioned her maybe once or twice in passing, but I never made her a focal point in my content. And the camera, they knew about my camera dying during a recording session the night before. I hadn't posted about that. I hadn't told anyone. How could they possibly know? I tried to reply to the email, but it bounced back immediately. The email address Catherine@redacted didn't seem to exist. I even tried typing the domain into my browser, but it led nowhere. It was as if the whole thing was a ghost email, sent to mess with me, and then vanish into thin air. The more I thought about it, the more anxious I became. Had someone hacked into my devices? Was I being watched through my phone or computer? I had heard stories about internet stalkers finding ways to spy on people, and now it felt like one of those stories was happening to me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. It had to be. Maybe it was just some troll who was really good at piecing together small bits of information. But the pit in my stomach kept growing. Then, last night, the real terror began. I was in bed with my wife, trying to fall asleep, but my mind kept racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I rolled over, facing the window, and noticed something strange. The street light outside our house, the one that usually cast a soft glow into our room, was flickering. At first, I brushed it off as nothing. Lights flicker all the time, but as I watched, the flickering grew more erratic. It wasn't a soft flicker anymore. It was like the light was strobing, blinking on and off in rapid succession. I got out of bed, feeling a strange pull to go check it out. I walked over to the window, peeking out through the curtains. That's when I saw it. Someone was standing outside, right on the edge of our front yard, just barely illuminated by the flickering street light. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall, wearing a long coat that seemed to blend into the night. They were standing perfectly still, facing the house, like they were watching. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the curtain so tightly I thought I might tear it. The person didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, motionless in the flickering light. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with a million thoughts. I wanted to wake my wife, call the police, do something, anything, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen, for the figure to come back, but they didn't. Eventually, I let go of the curtain and backed away from the window, my mind still reeling. I climbed back into bed, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing there, watching. This morning, I went outside, trying to reassure myself that it had just been my imagination, that maybe it was just a neighbor or a passerby. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Written in chalk on the walkway leading up to my front door were the words, "I'm always watching." The letters were uneven, scrawled in a hurried, jagged fashion. My mind raced as I stood there, staring at the message. They had been here, right outside my house, right outside my window, watching me. All those months of thinking it was over, of convincing myself that I was safe, came crashing down in an instant. This person wasn't gone. They hadn't moved on. They had been waiting, watching, keeping tabs on me the entire time. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a blur of fear and panic. Calling the police again seemed futile. What could they do with some chalk writing and the memory of a shadowy figure in the night? I felt trapped, cornered in my own life, like I was living in a horror movie I couldn't escape from. I rushed back inside, locking every door and window, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage to slide the deadbolt into place. I called my wife at work, trying to keep my voice steady, but the fear must have bled through, because she asked me if everything was okay. I didn't want to scare her, so I lied. I told her I was just feeling off, like I needed a break, and suggested we spend a few days somewhere else. She agreed, but I could hear the worrying in her voice. I packed a bag quickly, my heart still racing. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away, anywhere but here, anywhere but the place where I was being watched. I left, not looking back, and I haven't been home since. It almost caught me on the fourth try, the nightmare. It came so close that it tore through the first and second layers of skin on my back with one brutal swipe. I managed to cross the threshold and wake up before it could kill me, but it had never gotten that close before. Each time I escaped the dream, I would find a piece of the creature in the real world. At first I thought I was imagining things, but when I flicked on the lamp, there it was, something dark and monstrous that always disappeared the moment I turned on the light the first night. It was just a foot, black and clawed, protruding from the void of my closet. Then came a hand curling around my nightstand and a long, wet tongue poking through the bed frame. I'd see a new part of it every night, and just like that, it would vanish. By the fourth night, I thought maybe I'd broken the cycle. I woke up still shaking from the imaginary pain of having my back flayed open. But when I flicked the lamp on, I saw nothing at first. Where is it? I wondered. Then I caught it out of the corner of my eye, a bright red tongue, at least a foot long. Like the foot and hand from the nights before, it disappeared as soon as I saw it. It didn't seem real at the time, but it was terrifying enough to make my heart race. But the worst night was the one when I saw its eyes. After waking up from another near-death experience in the nightmare, I turned to my right to switch on the lamp. My hand hesitated, though. A sound stopped me breathing, labored and slow. Coming from beneath my bed, I looked down and saw them. Two yellow eyes staring back at me from the darkness beneath my bed. They were luminous, glowing, and blinking. I was frozen, my finger inches from the lamp switch, unable to move. I screamed at myself internally, willing myself to flick the switch, but I couldn't. All I could do was focus on the eyes and the creature's breath, like a fat man struggling to breathe after running too far. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I pressed the switch, flooding the room with light. The eyes disappeared, and I knew nothing would be there when I checked under the bed. The nightmare was just that, a nightmare until it wasn't. I kept telling myself that I was just a 15-year-old kid having bad dreams, that everyone has nightmares. Still, the recurring nightmares and the things I kept seeing were getting to me. I decided that if it happened again, if I had the dream and saw another part of the creature, I'd tell my parents. But I waited too long. The next night, I hoped for peace, but my prayers went unanswered. The dream began, like all the others, a long corridor flanked by walls of thick, black mist. The path stretched out before me, a distant doorway of light at the end. What should have been a short sprint felt like an impossible marathon, and I could feel the creature behind me, gaining on me with every second. The first time, I escaped easily. The monster had been miles away, and even though I stumbled, it couldn't catch up, but each night it started closer. The second time, it was nearer, and by the fourth, it had managed to claw into my back. By the fifth night, I knew it was hopeless. I ran as fast as I could, but the creature was faster. Its claws sank into my back again, and the pain was unbearable. It lifted me off the ground and roared into my ear, not in rage, but in something almost like gratitude. Then everything went black. I woke up with a burning sensation in my chest, the pain from the dream still lingering. I flicked on the lamp, ready for whatever piece of the nightmare had followed me this time. What I saw was the whole thing. Standing at the foot of my bed was the monster from my dreams, tall and gangly, with long arms that stretched past its knees. Its body was black, darker than darkness itself except for its glowing yellow eyes, crimson tongue, and jagged, off-white fangs. I expected it to vanish like before, but it didn't. It just stood there, staring at me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, closing my eyes and repeating the mantra in my head. When I opened them again, the creature was standing right in front of me. It reached out, its claws inches from my face. I thought I was imagining it. Then it touched me. Its hand was warm, careful not to scratch me with its claws. That's when I realized it was real. I threw myself back, hitting the wall. The creature stared at me with a look of betrayal before turning toward my bedroom door. It moved quickly, almost too quickly to track, and threw itself into the door, knocking it down with a loud crash. Then it rushed down the hallway toward my parents' room. I screamed, but it was too late. My mom's scream pierced the air first, followed by my dad's. I ran after the creature, knowing it was stupid, but I had to do something. When I reached the room, I saw the nightmare standing over my parents before it slid under the bed and disappeared into the darkness. The rest of that night was a blur. The police came, took me to my best friend Matt's house, and I stayed with his family. I told the cops the truth, but they must have told Matt's parents it was just a robbery gone wrong. I stayed with Matt that day, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. That night I fell asleep again, and the nightmare returned. This time I escaped easily, but when I woke up, I saw the monster's foot protruding from the closet again. That's when I knew it wasn't over. It wanted more, and I couldn't risk anyone else's life. So I ran. I left a note for Matt's family, took some food and money, and now I'm writing this from behind a McDonald's, hoping that I can find a way to stop this creature before it takes anyone else. If I can't figure it out soon, I'll have to end things myself. I'm sorry it's come to this, but I can't let anyone else suffer because of me. I was worried about my sister. Eliza had become withdrawn and stopped responding to any invitations to visit. The last time I spoke to her, she only asked, "Have you heard of the Cult of Dawn?" I hadn't and was confused. Eliza and I hadn't been close for a few years, but the desperation in her voice pulled at me. I made up my mind to visit her. It was just afternoon when I reached her house. The summer day was sweltering, a faint breeze the only relief. Her two-story home sat still and silent, as if no one had been inside for weeks. The once bright paint on the door was chipped, the cement steps covered in dry moss. The house had a faded, empty feel. Something was wrong. I stepped closer, and my unease grew with every step. I opened the door to a stale, lifeless air. "Eliza, it's Anna. Are you home?" I called, and a weak grunt came from upstairs. Relief washed over me. Eliza was alive. I could handle whatever was going on. I walked towards the stairs, scanning the house. Dust covered the windows and the doorways, and the air felt thick with something I couldn't quite place. As I reached her bedroom, I called again. "Eliza, I'm here," came the faint reply. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room had a sickly yellow glow, like the sun was stuck just before dawn. Eliza was huddled on a pile of clothes, her hair limp and stringy, her face gaunt, and her eyes hollow. A sickly sweet smell filled the room, mixing with the scent of sweat. I fought the urge to gag as I knelt beside her. "Eliza, what happened?" I asked. She turned away from me, muttering, "Take care of Jonah, Jonah." I frowned. "Who's Jonah?" She weakly gestured toward the bed. I looked over, and a small curly-haired boy with wide blue eyes peeked out from under it. "Jonah," I gasped. Holding out my arms, he shyly walked over to me, and I hugged him tightly. He seemed healthy, in stark contrast to my sister. "Eliza, we need to get you out of here," I said, my worrying growing. You need to go to the hospital. It's too late, she whispered. What do you mean? Her eyes flicked to the window. What do you see? I turned toward the narrow, high window, the strange orange-yellow sky catching my attention. It was the color of a festering wound, the sky. It looks strange, I muttered, the unease tightening its grip on me. The cult of dawn, she murmured. Eliza, you're not making any sense, I said, gathering a bag and starting to pack. I had to get her and Jonah out of there. I carried Jonah into the kitchen, searching for food, but found nothing. As I rummaged, I heard the sound of his tiny feet pattering toward the bedroom. When I followed him back, I heard muffled cries for help. Jonah was being dragged under the bed by something a thick, tar-like void. I screamed, pulling him back with all my strength. Suddenly, the void released him. I held him close, my heart pounding, as I backed away. Dark tendrils of smoke oozed from beneath the bed, and the air grew thick with dread. I had to get us out. Clutching Jonah, I bolted down the stairs, but a voice like grinding metal followed me. Mine, it rasped, hot breath against my neck. I ran faster, slamming the door open and rushing outside, but the world outside wasn't normal. The same sickly yellow hue tainted everything: the street, the trees, even the neighboring houses. The sky was void of sunlight, dull and oppressive. My stomach dropped as I realized I wasn't free of whatever horror had taken hold of my sister's house. The darkness from the house began to move, creeping toward me like a predator. I screamed a desperate cry for help, for anyone to hear. Suddenly a hand touched my shoulder, and I spun around, nearly falling over in terror. The bright sun nearly blinded me. I blinked, realizing I was back in the real world. A man with dark hair was staring at me, confused. Jonah was still clinging to me, but everything else was a blur. The next thing I knew, I was in a hospital, answering questions I couldn't understand. All I knew was I had to stay in the light, stay out of the orange sky. Days passed in a haze of confusion and fear. Finally, I found myself staring out of the hospital window, the warmth of the sun comforting against my skin. The memories of what happened at Eliza's house came flooding back. My heart ached. I had left my sister behind. She was gone, lost to whatever evil had taken her, but Jonah was safe. That was the only solace I had left. Suddenly, a nurse entered the room, calling my name. Anna, do you know where you are? In a hospital, I replied. Where's Jonah? Is he okay? The nurse looked puzzled. Jonah. She excused herself to get the doctor. When Dr. Matthews entered, I asked him the same question. Where is Jonah, my sister's son? The doctor's eyes flickered with something I couldn't place. Let me show you, he said. I followed him in silence, the pit in my stomach growing with each step. We descended into the basement of the hospital, stopping outside a door marked morgue. I glanced at the doctor, fear creeping into my chest. Your sister didn't have a son, he said quietly, pushing the door open. Inside, on a sterile cot, lay a mummified body of a small child. Its skin was dry and cracked, with sickly yellow wisps of hair clinging to its scalp. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the tiny body take a shallow breath. Dr. Matthews leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. Behold the fruition of the cult of dawn. As Anna stood frozen in disbelief, her eyes locked on the mummified child. A cold dread seeped into her bones. The small exhale from the boy's chest was impossible. Jonah, or whatever he had become, shouldn't be alive. Yet there was a faint movement, a breath. Her heart pounded, her mind racing for answers. Could this still be Jonah? Dr. Matthews watched her closely, his eyes dark and unreadable. What did you do to him? Anna's voice trembled, and her knees felt weak. He is not your sister's son, Anna, Dr. Matthews said, his voice low, almost soothing. What you're seeing is a vessel, a form taken by the darkness that follows the cult of dawn. The moment you entered that house, the moment you made contact with him, it started. The transition. Anna's mouth went dry, the word a bitter taste on her tongue. Yes, he replied. The cult of dawn is not just a myth, it is a force that feeds on despair, hopelessness, and the souls of those too weak to resist. Your sister was already claimed long before you arrived. The boy Jonah, he was the conduit, a bait to lure you in. He paused. It was always meant to be you, Anna. Anna felt a chill crawl down her spine. No, she whispered, shaking her head, refusing to believe what he was saying. I saved him. I pulled him out of that ... That thing, I felt him. I held him. The darkness let you take him, Dr. Matthews said, his tone now cutting. It knew you would run. It needed you to bond with him, to anchor its hold on you. The child you saved wasn't Jonah. It was the cult's creation, and now it's inside of you. Anna's legs gave way, and she slumped against the cold, sterile wall. The memories of the chase, the sickly yellow sky, the voice that had whispered mine behind her, all rushed back in a wave of nausea. It wasn't just the house. It had followed her. I need to leave, she said suddenly, pushing herself up, her movements frantic. I need to get out of here, away from this place, away from you. You can't leave, Dr. Matthews said calmly, stepping closer. It's too late. The only way to survive now is to let it finish its course. Fighting it will only prolong your suffering. Anna's breath quickened. Her mind was spiraling, every instinct screaming for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The world outside wasn't safe anymore. She had seen it, felt it. Even now, the air seemed heavier, like the light was being drained from the very walls. Suddenly, a faint cry broke through her panic. A child's voice, soft and distant, calling her name. Anna ... double quotes. Her blood ran cold. It was Jonah's voice. She turned, searching the room, her pulse racing as the voice grew louder. Anna ... Help me ... double quotes. Tears blurred her vision. She tried to block out the sound, but it was everywhere. Was this another trick, another creation of the cult? Or was it really Jonah, trapped somewhere between life and death, calling out to her for help? You hear him now, don't you? Dr. Matthews asked, his voice taking on an eerie calmness. That's how it starts. First, it whispers. Then it becomes stronger, until you can't tell what's real anymore. Anna's heart clenched in agony. Where is he? What have you done with him? Dr. Matthews stepped back, folding his arms as if watching the inevitable unfold. He's still in the house, where he always was, but by now he's not your concern. You should be worried about yourself. Her head spun as Dr. Matthews' words sank in. He was telling the truth. She knew it deep down. Jonah, her sweet nephew, had never made it out of the house. The creature she had held on to wasn't him, but his voice still echoed in her mind, begging her to come back, to save him. Suddenly, the sterile walls of the hospital began to melt, warping into the familiar yellow glow of the house. The windows dripped with that same sickly, pus-like light. She wasn't in the hospital anymore. She was back in Eliza's house. Her breath caught in her throat as she found herself standing once again in the doorway of Eliza's bedroom. The foul stench of rot and decay clung to the air. On the bed, Eliza's broken, frail form lay motionless, her eyes wide open but unseeing, her lips twisted into a silent scream. And there, under the bed, she saw the black tendrils creeping, reaching, like smoke slithering toward her. A shadowy figure rose from the darkness, its form indistinct yet terrifying, its hollow eyes fixed on her. You belong to the dawn, the figure hissed. Anna stumbled back, tripping over something soft. She looked down. Jonah's golden hair gleamed in the dim light. He was lying on the floor, lifeless, his eyes staring up at her with that same haunted look. "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I won't let you take me." The figure moved closer, looming over her like a dark shroud, the air thick with its presence. It reached out a hand, cold and clawed, its voice filling her mind with whispers of surrender. But deep inside, a spark of defiance ignited within her. She wasn't going to let it win. "Not this time. I don't belong to you," she growled, standing her ground. The shadow paused, its form wavering as if it hadn't expected resistance. "I belong to myself," she shouted, her voice growing stronger. "I belong to the light." With those words, the yellow light that had filled the house began to shift, fading into a warm, golden glow. The sickly atmosphere lifted, and the tendrils retreated. The shadow hissed, recoiling as if burned by the light. Suddenly, Anna was back in the hospital room, gasping for air, her body trembling from the ordeal. Dr. Matthews was gone, replaced by a concerned nurse who rushed to her side. "Anna, are you okay?" the nurse asked. Anna looked around, her heart pounding, but the room was still. The nightmare had faded, but she knew it wasn't over. "I need to find Jonah," she whispered, determination burning in her chest, because somewhere, deep inside, she knew he was still waiting for her, and the cult of dawn wasn't finished with them yet. I've dealt with sleep paralysis before. If you've never experienced it, consider yourself lucky. It's nothing short of terrifying. You wake up, but your body refuses to move. You're frozen, paralyzed in your own skin, stuck inside your own head, helpless. Often, it comes with hallucinations, shadow sliding along the walls, whispers just beyond your hearing. But as terrifying as it is, I always found some comfort in knowing it was all in my head. Last night, that comfort was stripped away from me. It started just like any other episode. I woke up in the middle of the night, instantly recognizing that familiar sensation of paralysis. My room was cloaked in darkness, the sense of dread crawling over me like a heavy blanket. I told myself it was just another episode, that it would pass. It always did. I couldn't blink or move a muscle, but I could see just barely the faint outlines of my room, my dresser, the chair by the window, and the door slightly ajar. Then I heard it, tap, tap, tap. It was a soft sound at first, like something brushing against the floor. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of the darkness. The noise grew louder, accompanied by a faint rustling, like fabric scraping the wood, moving closer. That's when I saw it, what I can only describe as a hand. It was pale, thin, and slowly sliding out from under my bed. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my body remained frozen. I kept repeating to myself, "It's just a hallucination. It's not real," like a broken mantra. But the hand was still there. Its long, bony fingers gripped the edge of the bed frame, followed by an arm, then a head. This wasn't like the shadowy figures I'd seen in past episodes, dark shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, figments of a half-conscious mind. No, this was something else entirely, the figure that crawled out from beneath my bedhead skin, that was a sickly gray, almost translucent, stretched to thin over an emaciated frame, and his eyes to black were fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to get away from it. But I was still trapped, stuck in the horrifying silence of paralysis. The thing crawled closer slowly, as if savoring the moment. The closer it got, the more I could smell it, an overwhelming stench of decay, like rotting meat left in the sun. It stopped at the side of my bed, its face inches from mine. Its breath hit my skin, cold and damp, and I could feel tears sliding down my cheeks. Then it did something that still haunts me. It smiled. The smile wasn't human. It stretched far too wide, curling its cracked lips up in a grotesque display that revealed rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The skin around its mouth seemed to tear as it grinned, the corners of its lips pulling back further and further until it looked like the grin would consume its entire face. Dark, empty gums peeked through the gaps in its teeth, and its eyes seemed to shimmer with something that felt like amusement, mocking me, watching me suffer. Then it reached out. The creature's hand crept toward me with agonizing slowness, and I could hear every knuckle crack as its fingers extended. Its skin looked like leather gray, shriveled and clammy. When it touched my cheek, it felt like ice-cold leather, damp and unsettling, like it had been soaking in stagnant water. The moment its fingers made contact with my skin, a violent shock surged through me, and suddenly I could move again. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air as though I had been drowning. My chest heaved, my heart thundering in my ears. I looked around, expecting to see the creature still looming over me, but the room was empty. Silent, I sat there, frozen in place for what felt like hours, my eyes glued to the dark space beneath my bed, waiting for something to crawl out again. But nothing came. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. This morning, I tried to convince myself it was just another episode of sleep paralysis, just my mind playing tricks on me, warping reality into something terrifying. But as the day wore on, I started to feel uneasy. The air in the house felt different, colder, heavier, like the temperature had dropped drastically in a matter of seconds. It was subtle at first, but then the atmosphere itself seemed to change. There was this oppressive weight, almost like the walls were closing in, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't just me. I could feel something was wrong, like a presence lingering just out of sight. There was this strange pull, annoying urge deep inside me to go back to my room. I didn't want to, I knew I didn't want to, but something compelled me to check. It was as if some part of me already knew what I would find, but I had to confirm it, had to see it for myself. I should have walked away. I should have ignored that feeling, but I couldn't. It was like an invisible thread pulling me closer, leading me toward the thing I had hoped was nothing more than a nightmare. I opened the door to my bedroom and stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The room was colder than the rest of the house, the air so thick it was almost suffocating. And then I saw it. My Uncle Joe was a house flipper. He'd been doing it for years, buying up abandoned or distressed properties, fixing them up, and selling them for a profit. Every summer I worked with him. It was tough work, but it beat the monotony of a fast food joint or a soul-sucking call center. Plus, the stories from those old houses were worth more than a paycheck. We found some crazy stuff in those old places. I'll never forget the hunting lodge with a fully functional moonshine still hidden in the basement, or that old ranch house filled with strange clay statues scattered everywhere. Once we found this old painting of a little girl, Maggie, according to the plaque on it. She died when she was only 7. That one stuck with me. Tossing it in the dumpster felt wrong, like we were erasing the memory of someone who'd once mattered. Uncle Joe never kept anything from the houses, and neither did I except once. There was this old split level out in the counter. It wasn't in bad shape, just needed some TLC. Inside, the only furniture left was a broken-down TV and an old roll-top desk. When I opened that desk, I found a leather-bound journal. On the cover, scrawled in shaky block letters, were the words "Nightmare Journal." I wasn't supposed to take it, but I did dot, it was packed with page after page of nightmares, hundreds of them, all written in neat, tiny handwriting. The first entry read, "My name is Adam. This is going to be my nightmare journal. The shrink says it might help, but I don't know. I'm also not supposed to call him a shrink. I don't know why I couldn't leave it behind. Maybe I was hoping to understand the person who had lived with such horror. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity. I've had the journal for years now, and though it feels wrong to share someone else's pain, I'm going to post a few of the entries here. Maybe someone can make sense of them, or maybe it's just too late to matter." Here's one of the early entries that shook me the most. "It wouldn't be hell if it wasn't forever. The pale man says, standing over me, he shouldn't be able to speak. He has no mouth, no face, just a round, jagged hole filled with broken bone and raw flesh. He's holding an old lamp that smokes and flickers, and in the other hand is something like a staff, covered in pulsating veins. His clothes are tattered, and he smells faintly of ashes. I'm cold, naked, drenched in sweat. Fear coils in my guts like a snake made of ice, and I can't move. I try to speak, but all that comes out is a sound like a bleating lamb. Around me are dimly lit dead trees, and the stench of decay fills the air. I'm standing on slick, moss-covered black stones, forming a rough path leading into the darkness. The pale man is still there, his lamp casting shadows that seem to writhe. I run. I leave him and his terrible lamp behind and run blindly into the trees. The light above me is a pale silver, but I can't look up. My body won't let me. I know, deep in my bones, that looking at that light will be the end of me, and more terrifying than anything I've ever known. So I keep my eyes on the ground, on the dead trees, on the endless, winding path. I run for hours, maybe days. There is no time here, just the darkness, the fear, and the endless pounding of my feet against the stone, sand, gravel, and dirt. My feet are bleeding, each step a sharp, searing pain. But I keep running. Dot in the distance, I see a mound, a hill, glowing with a warm, red light, the color of old roses. As I get closer, I realize it's not a hill, but a pyramid. Ancient-looking, with steps leading to the top. I climb, leaving bloody footprints in my wake. At the top, there's a throne made of black stone, and sitting on the throne is the pale man. Before me, the ground opens into a pit of mouth made of flesh and bone, sucking in, chewing at the air. The pale man gestures toward it, and I feel my legs give out beneath me. I fall into the pit, into that hungry, endless mud. Dot as I fall, I finally look up and see the source of the silver light, and I, a vast, infinite eye filled with sadness and wisdom. It sees me, every part of me, then looks away, as though I'm nothing. I'm being torn apart. My hands and feet go first, then my arms and legs. I feel every moment of it. I am just a torso, then a head. Then I'm nothing at all. I am dust in a black hurricane, scattered and insignificant. And then I wake, lying on those same black, moss-covered stones. It wouldn't be hell if it wasn't forever. The pale man says again. I wake up screaming. This was a really bad one. I need more sleeping pills. That was the first entry that really shook me. There are more, some even longer and more detail, but they all have this same feeling of dread, of something uncheckable. Let me know if you want to hear more. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what Adam went through, but reading these entries gives me a glimpse into a world I hope I never have to visit. A few weeks ago, I installed a Ring camera by my front door, thinking it was unnecessary. My neighborhood is quiet, and I never had a reason to be worried, but after a string of break-ins nearby, I thought it might be wise to have some extra security. For the first couple of weeks, the camera only picked up harmless activity, cats wandering by or the occasional delivery truck. It was all normal, but last night something changed. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected at your front door. Half asleep, I assumed it was another stray animal or maybe a passing car. I had a few false alarms before, so I didn't think much of it. I opened the app, expecting to see nothing unusual, but what I saw was me standing on my porch, looking directly into the camera. It was someone who looked exactly like me. Same gray sweatpants, same faded t-shirt, even the same messy hair. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was still half dreaming, but no, the figure was still there, still me, except I was inside, in bed. How could I be outside? At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a delayed recording of me from earlier in the night or some weird glitch with the camera, but I hadn't stepped outside at all. And the figure on the screen wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, facing the camera, like it was waiting. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I watched, my heart pounding. What was it? A prank? A doppelganger? I wanted to get up and check the door, but I was frozen in place, too terrified to confront whatever was outside. I kept watching for several minutes. The figure remained motionless, like a statue. It didn't blink, it didn't shift. It just stared. Finally, I checked the timestamp. 3:04 a.m. I sat there for another minute, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move an inch. By 3:15, I couldn't take it anymore. I clicked out of the app, hoping the screen would go black and this nightmare would end. But as I sat there in the dark, my mind raced. Was someone messing with me? Was it even possible? My house is locked tight, and no one has a key. I fought the urge to get up and leave, convincing myself it was just a glitch or a sick joke. But when I reopened the app to check the footage, the figure was gone. The porch was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. I scrolled back to the timestamp, but the video wasn't there. It was like the recording from 3:04 a.m. had been wiped clean. I spent the entire day today trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was still dreaming, or maybe the camera malfunctioned. I even considered calling the police. But what would I say? That I saw myself standing outside? Now, I'm not so sure what to believe, because it's happening again. Just moments ago, I got another notification. Motion detected at your front door. And when I opened the app, there I was again, staring into the camera, same clothes, same expression. But this time the figure is closer to the door. I haven't moved from my bed, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever this is, it's getting bolder. It's just standing there, waiting. It was many years ago, after my father had passed away. I was just 8 years old, living with my mother. One summer, we were invited by her relatives to visit her hometown in the countryside. My mother was hesitant, very reluctant, actually, but for some reason, she eventually agreed to return. Her village was deep in the mountains, isolated, forgotten by time. My mother had left that place long ago and never spoke of it. And as we headed there, I could sense her unease. Maybe it's just a small, forgotten place, he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. We had no choice but to walk deeper into the misty mountains. My mother seemed nervous, but I was just a kid, too young to understand her fear. The village, as she told me, had been there since the Song dynasty, ancient and hidden from the rest of the world. As we walked, I began to feel dizzy. My mother picked me up, and whisper some words I didn't understand. This wasn't unusual. Every summer, I'd get these dizzy spells, and my mother had a way of calming them. Though I never knew how, we wandered through the dense fog, my mother's steps growing more frantic, as if she couldn't find her way. Then, out of the mist, an old man appeared. He wore a bamboo hat, and his clothes were tattered and faded. His face was thin, his skin stretched tightly over his bones, and his smile was unsettling. My mother said nothing, just kept walking, ignoring him despite the beads of sweat forming on her brow. The old man watched us for a moment, then disappeared back into the fog. After he left, my mother's fear grew palpable. She changed her mind and wanted to leave the mountains, but no matter where we went, we couldn't escape. The fog seemed to close in around us, and eventually we stumbled upon a village. The village was clear of fog, but something about it felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. My mother's eyes darted around, wide with fear. She kept running, trying to escape, but every path led us back to the same place. Then my head began to ache again, and this time the visions came, visions that weren't mine. In my mind I saw a face, a green face, monstrous and shifting, that would contort and twist into a black sphere. The pain was unbearable, and I felt as though I were slipping into someone else's memories. Suddenly we saw them, a procession of people dressed in red, carrying an ancient-looking sedan chair, like something from an old wedding ceremony. But these figures weren't alive. They had no breath, no life. They smelled of decay, their presence foul and unnatural. My mother pulled me into the trees to hide as the procession passed by, the air thick with the stench of death. From inside the sedan chair came blood-curdling screams. I trembled uncontrollably, my body betraying me as I tried to stay silent. My mother clamped her hand over my mouth, her own fear barely contained. We stayed hidden until the wedding procession had vanished into the mist. But when we emerged from the trees, the path was filled with figures. They weren't people. Their pale skin hung loosely, like it was draped over their bones. Their faces, like the old man's, were stretched into eerie smiles. They stared at my mother as if they could read her mind, as if they had been waiting for us. My mother carried me down the path, which I now realized was lined with craves. Tears streamed down her face. She whispered to herself, talking about a sacrifice she had escaped, begging forgiveness for her innocent child. She muttered something about a female ghost seeking revenge, and I realized that whatever awaited us was something my mother had been running from for a long time. As we ran through the village, we saw things that shouldn't exist: black cats with glowing eyes, enormous rats emerging from the graves, and rotting humanoid creatures that watched us from the shadows. But the worst was yet to come. We found ourselves face to face with the wedding procession again. The sedan chair was waiting for us, and from the inside came a laugh that chilled me to my bones. Slowly, a pair of pale hands lifted the curtain, revealing a figure in a red dress. Her hair was wild, her face deathly pale, her nails as red as blood. She wasn't human. She was a monster, a spirit of hatred and revenge. My mother stood frozen, her eyes wide with despair. She put me down, screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the woman was upon her, her strength unnatural. She grabbed my mother by the hair and, with a swift, violent motion, tore her scalp from her head. My mother crumpled to the ground, barely alive, her eyes pleading with me to flee. The woman laughed again, her voice filled with malice. "I want everyone to feel my resentment," she hissed, her eyes locking onto me. She started toward me, but my mother, with the last of her strength, grabbed at her legs, trying to stop her. With a sickening twist, the woman ripped my mother's head clean off. I stood frozen, my heart breaking, my mind spiraling into rage and despair. Visions of the past flashed before me, memories of a village cursed by 108 demons, of a love-driven suicide that had doomed countless others, and in the center of it all, the green-faced beast. As the woman approached, something inside me snapped. The sky above, once fogged over, cleared to reveal a black sphere, blowing ominously. The ground shook, and I felt power surge through me, rage, sorrow, vengeance. The woman screamed as her body was torn apart, her soul obliterated. I didn't know what I had become, but in that moment, I knew I had destroyed her completely. The spirits of the mountain dissolved, their howls echoing into the distance as the black sphere's hateful light illuminated the sky. This is my memory. Years later, I read about the 108 demons that destroyed the Song dynasty and about the green-faced beast, one of them. I also learned about a woman in a mountain village who committed suicide out of love. But none of that matters now. I will find the other 107 demons. This story still haunts me to this day. Growing up in the early 90s, I was plagued by a recurring nightmare, one that has followed me well into adulthood. Now, at 35 years old, I still can't shake it. And lately, it's begun to feel even more real. It all started when I was just 4 years old. Back then, I had what most people would call sleep paralysis demons, and I struggled with night terrors. I was a difficult baby from the time I was born until I was about 3 years old, colicky, inconsolable. But it was at age 4 that I could finally communicate to my parents about the terrifying dreams that kept me awake. Little did I know that was just the beginning of what I now call my gift. Imagine being in a dream, but knowing it's a dream. You're aware, fully conscious, and can control your actions within the dream world. People call this lucid dreaming, but imagine having that ability at 6 years old, and all you see is horror. Every night, demons slicing my mom's neck slowly, my father being dipped into acid, his skin melting off, screaming in agony as his bones burned. That was my nightly reality from ages 4 to 6. I couldn't take it, so I found a way to change things, to consciously take control of the dream. If my mom was being boiled alive, I'd stop it. If my dad was burning, I'd make it so he wasn't. I thought I had it all figured out. I was in control. No matter what terrifying image the dream presented to me, I could rewrite it. I believed that nothing could touch me when I was asleep. But I was wrong, you see. When you gain true control over your unconscious dreams, there are rules, unspoken rules, but rules nonetheless. Never acknowledge that you have control. Never. Ever eat or drink anything offered to you. If you can fly, use it to your advantage. Those were the rules, and for about 15 years I followed them. I had no issues with lucid dreaming, no repercussions until one night. That night, the dream started like many others. I was wandering through an abandoned psychiatric ward, the air thick with decay and emptiness. I found an elevator and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors opened, revealing a long, dimly lit corridor with doors on either side. At the end of the hall stood a woman. She had gray, balding hair, and her body looked frail, her posture hunched. But even from a distance, I could feel her presence. At first, she had her head down, her face hidden. Then she called out in a raspy voice, "Aren't you a little too early?" She looked up, and I saw her eyes. They were flashing black and white, like a spirally hypnotic pattern from an old horror movie. She cackled, and then, in an instant, launched herself toward me. I was still standing in the elevator, but she was flying down the hallway, her scream growing louder and more piercing with every second. I slammed the elevator buttons in a panic, desperate to escape. The doors barely shut in time, her nails scraping against the metal as she wailed on the other side. The elevator jerked upward, and everything went silent. When the doors opened again, I found myself on the 7th floor. The layout was identical to the 3rd floor, same hallway, same doors, but no sign of the woman. I took a tentative step outside, my hand still gripping the edge of the elevator door. The air felt thick with tension. Suddenly, a shadow appeared, a figure without a clear form, and it spoke to me. These are all the decisions you could have made in your life. I will grant you one look, one opportunity to see what it was, what it is, or what it could be. Choose wisely, for it may come to pass. I was still rattled from the encounter with the woman, my heart racing, my mind spinning, but I couldn't ignore the shadow's words. I began walking down the hallway, brushing my fingers along the doors, feeling their energy. Some were cold to the touch, others gave off a sense of dread. This one's cold. Definitely not, I thought. This one feels ... not right. But I don't trust it. I kept going until I came to a door that felt familiar. It reminded me of the closet door in my bedroom, the one I would hide in whenever I was scared. It felt safe, like a sanctuary. I opened the door. She was there, the gray-haired woman with the hypnotic eyes, laughing, her scream laugh echoing through the hall. She lunged at me, her nails digging into my face. I felt the sharp, burning pain beneath my eye, and before I could react, I woke up, screaming. When I touched my face, I realized something horrifying. The scars under my left eye were real. To this day, I don't know what happened. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a dream, that the scars came from something else. But deep down, I know the truth. And I still see her, sometimes waiting at the end of that hallway. I never thought being an introvert could be the death of me. One of the few times I actually wanted to leave my house, and it wouldn't let me. The universe sure has a twisted sense of humor. Let me clarify. By it, I mean the house itself. Last night I had too much to drink. Completely plastered, I decided that what I needed more than anything was a burger. So I put on pants, grabbed my house key, phone, and wallet, and headed for the front door. I opened it, expecting to step out into the crisp night air, but instead I walked straight back into my living room. At first, I thought it was the alcohol messing with me. Maybe I was more drunk than I realized, and this was my brain's way of telling me to take it easy, go to bed, sleep it off. But when I'm drunk, rational thoughts don't come easy, and I was hungry. So I shut the door, walked through the house, and headed for the back door. No big deal. I'd just take the back way. The back door has a window, and I could see the yard outside, the street lamp casting a soft glow, the breeze swaying the branches of the old pine tree in the corner. Everything looked normal, so I opened the door and stepped back into my living room again. Now I was starting to panic. Maybe the whiskey was bad. Maybe that homemade moonshine a friend gave me for Christmas had something extra in it. Either way, I figured this was a sign. I was too messed up to go anywhere, and my brain was shutting me down. Fine, I thought. I'll go to bed, deal with the hangover tomorrow, and figure out what happened then. But that's when things started to get really strange. As I climbed the stairs to my room, it felt like I was walking for ages. No matter how many steps I took, the top of the staircase seemed farther and farther away. I looked behind me, and everything seemed normal. Looked up, same thing. Finally, I stared down at my feet, forcing myself to focus, and within seconds I was at the top. I chalked it up to the booze again, and made my way to my bedroom. Collapsing on my pillow felt like a small victory. Whatever had just happened, I was done with it. I'd sleep it off and deal with it in the morning. But now, it's 3 in the afternoon. I woke up an hour ago, convinced that last night was just a vivid alcohol-fueled dream. I got dressed, went to leave through the front door and ended up back in the living room. Again, no amount of logic can explain what's happening. I'm not hungover anymore, I'm not stressed, but I'm trapped. Every time I try to leave through a door, it leads me back to the same room. I've tried it over and over: the front door, the back door, even the garage. They all bring me back to the living room. I can see the outside world through the windows. The sun is shining, people are walking by on the sidewalk. But every time I open the door to step outside, the world vanishes, replaced by the familiar, but now suffocating space of my house. I try the window in the hall, the one that leads to the front yard. It doesn't have a bug screen because the neighbors tore it up weeks ago. I can see the street outside, sun streaming through the glass. I slide the window open, but instead of fresh air, I'm looking into a hallway. A blank, featureless hall that stretches on indefinitely. I lean out, confused, peering down the length of the hall. To my left is a plain white door, but to the right the hallway stretches endlessly. Something is moving down there, a shadow, a mass, something crawling toward me. There's a rumbling sound, and the window frame shakes as whatever it is comes closer. I can make out arms, dozens of them, reaching out from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, all pulling the creature forward. In the center of the mass is a gaping mouth, filled with teeth the color of dried blood. The sight of it paralyzes me. I slam the window shut just before it reaches me. My heart's racing. I press my back against the wall and look outside again. There's a squirrel running along the branches of the tree in the yard. Everything looks so peaceful, but I'm losing it. I must be. There's no way every door and window leads me back into this house, or worse, into whatever that hallway was. I close my eyes, trying to calm myself. When I open them again, the window is gone. In its place is a blank wall, the same off-white color as the rest of the house. I scramble to the other doors and windows, but they're all gone too. Every exit, every window, every means of escape replaced with solid walls. I'm trapped. You mean to tell me that I have been stuck here for 66 years? Man, I've seen some things these past few days, but holy shit, that's gotta take the cake, Jasper mumbled through bites of the sandwich I made him. The poor guy hadn't eaten since he got trapped here. When he said that, I realized neither had I. Yeah, things have really changed out there. Lots of crazy shit going down, I reply, biting into my food. So what the hell were you running from back there? The terror, he said, his voice dropping. Not entirely sure what it is, but it's got a lot of arms and ... well, a void, I think, for a mouth. Whatever it is, it's terrifying. I saw it, I said, shuddering at the memory. When I tried escaping through the window, it just led into another hallway I'd never seen before. That thing was pulling itself toward me. Jasper just shrugged, finishing his food, looking around the room in awe. He hadn't seen a television in decades, but our moment of peace was shattered by a sudden rumble from the kitchen area. We exchanged looks as the sound grew louder. That's our cue to leave, my friend, Jasper said, leaping from the couch and running toward the hallway. He stopped, looking at the 3 doors around him, considering his options. Don't try the bathroom. It's gone, I said, running up beside him. Mind telling me why we're running and what we're running into? Well, he started, choosing the door straight ahead. We're running from that same damn thing. As for where we're headed, it depends on the house. Sometimes it's a room, sometimes it's a hall. You never really know. We dove through the door and slammed it shut behind us. The rumbling grew louder, but we didn't dare look back. We ran, feet pounding against the hardwood floor. The noise of clawing and slapping echoed behind us. Against my better judgment, I glanced back. The many-armed creature was closing in, its chasm of a mouth open wide, revealing that unnatural shade of red. As I looked closer, a memory clicked, a flashback to my college days, astronomy. I realized with horror that what I was looking at wasn't just a void. It was a black hole. The event horizon, that faint glow, was what gave off the hue of red. Everything around the creature warped, sucked toward the center, and then released, as if it was breathing. Stop looking at it, kid. Jasper's voice jolted me back to reality. He was still running ahead, straining to find a way out. About 100 yards ahead, a door on the right stood slightly ajar, light spilling through. Found our exit. Get ready. Grabbing my arm, Jasper yanked me along as he dove through the door. We stumbled into a small room bathed in dim candlelight. The walls were the same off-white as the rest of the house, and to our left was a large set of double doors. Directly across from us was an altar of sorts, covered in scattered red candles. In the center sat an old, dusty book, its pages yellowed with age. Jasper walked over and brushed the dust off the book, flipping through the pages. I, on the other hand, tried the double doors. They wouldn't budge. The brass handles were tarnished, and no amount of pushing or pulling made any difference. Does that book say anything about getting out of here? I asked, walking over to Jasper. The text on the pages was strange. As I watched, the words shifted, changing languages: English, Latin, Russian, and symbols I didn't recognize. You seeing this? I whispered, watching the words transform into jagged lines and dots that seemed completely alien. Yeah, it keeps changing. I could read it until it got to this part, Jasper muttered, flipping through the pages faster. Finally, we came to a large illustration, a crude drawing of the many-armed creature. Words at the top of the page flickered between languages. What does it say? I asked, unable to read the text. It's Latin, he replied. It says the gatekeeper must be paid. Jasper flipped to the next page, revealing a disturbing drawing of the creature devouring a human, the figure spiraling into nothingness within the gaping maw. So that thing is the gatekeeper? I asked, dread washing over me. And what does it mean it must be paid? If the gatekeeper is the key to getting out, then it looks like its toll is a human sacrifice, Jasper whispered, more to himself than to me. His voice was filled with an eerie resignation. Suddenly, the rumbling returned, louder this time, accompanied by the familiar scratching from outside the door. I ran to the double doors again, pulling at them in desperation. Still no luck. Jasper was frozen by the altar, panic flooding his eyes. We're trapped, I whispered, backing away from the door as the scratching grew closer. I glanced at Jasper, who was now holding one of the candlesticks, gripping it tightly. You're seriously going to try to fight it? I asked, my voice trembling. No, he whispered, stepping toward me. It wants ... no. It needs the toll to be paid. I'm sorry. Before I could react, Jasper lunged at me, swinging the candlestick. His face was filled with remorse, but his actions were certain. He raised it above his head, and as the candle's flame flickered out, the scratching outside slowed to a halt. The scratching in the hallway slowed as Jasper raised the candlestick above my head, as if the creature outside was patiently waiting to see who would fall first. It seemed to be anticipating the next victim, ready to claim whoever lost this twisted battle. I'm sorry, man, Jasper choked out, tears streaking his face. I barely managed to raise my arms to block the blow. but the heavy metal collided with my forearm, a sickening crack filling the air. Pain shot through me like lightning, and I stumbled back against the locked double doors, clutching my broken arm. Please, you don't have to do this. There's got to be another way. I screamed, voice desperate, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Don't let that thing take me. Don't do this. But Jasper just kept advancing, guilt in his eyes but determination in his step. His hands gripped the candlestick tighter as he prepared to strike again. The scratching at the door grew louder, closer. Whatever was waiting out there was just beyond the threshold now. With my good arm cradling my injured one, I scrambled to the opposite corner of the room. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through me, but fear kept me moving. Jasper's eyes gleamed with a mix of fear and resolve, the flickering light from the altar's candles reflecting off the sweat on his face. I had to do something. I wasn't going down like this. In a frantic move, I darted behind him and crashed into the altar, knocking candles to the floor. Flames caught the old carpet immediately, spreading fast to the wooden walls and cheap paneling. The room erupted in a burst of fire, the heat forcing Jasper to stumble back, shielding his face from the growing inferno. Come on. Just let me go, Jasper shouted over the roar of the flames, his face filled with panic. I've been trapped here for decades. There's a world out there I need to get back to. The fire spread quickly, curling up the walls, consuming everything in its path. I took the moment of distraction and made a break for the double doors. They finally gave way, swinging open as I tumbled into the living room, landing hard on the couch behind me. The gatekeeper surged through the burning doorway, its many arms reaching into the room, hungry for its prize. The fire didn't seem to bother it. Instead, the flames were sucked into the void that served as its mouth, extinguished as if they had never existed. Jasper barreled through the living room after me, but in his haste he tripped over the couch and fell face first onto the floor. The flames surged through the doorway, consuming the room at an alarming rate. I could see the gatekeeper's arms snaking through the fire, its black hole-like maw pulling everything into its endless void. The room was collapsing into chaos. I made a desperate run for the front door, pounding on it, trying to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, panic rising in my throat as Jasper grabbed me from behind. With a grunt, he hurled me backward toward the burning altar, directly into the gatekeeper's waiting arms. As I tumbled toward the gaping void, the front door finally flew open. A brilliant light poured into the room, blinding, intense, like the radiance of 1,000 burning suns. I caught a brief glimpse of Jasper, his face twisted in horror, before the light engulfed him. In an instant, his body evaporated, disintegrating like dust in the wind. Consumed by the searing brightness, the gatekeeper's arms closed around me, pulling me into the cold abyss of its mouth. My vision blurred as the heat from the fire was replaced by an all-consuming cold, a chilling void that drained every ounce of warmth from my body. My breath caught in my throat as gravity disappeared, leaving me weightless, suspended in the dark. For a moment, I thought this was it, that I was going to be lost forever in this cosmic nightmare. But then something changed. I was flung backward, hurled out of the void and through the event horizon of the black hole. I fell through endless darkness, tumbling through time and space. Galaxies whirled past me, stars exploded into supernovas, and planets crumbled into dust. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The beauty of the universe laid bare before my eyes as I spiraled through the fabric of reality itself. And then, through the chaos, I saw them, massive, godlike figures larger than entire galaxies floating through the void, their bodies torn apart, their innards creating stars and planets from their dismembered remains. Dead gods, their corpses scattered across the universe, fueling creation itself. I felt a scream building inside me, but there was no air to release it, no sound in the cold vacuum of space. Just as I thought I would lose myself to the madness of it all, something yanked me back. A force grabbed hold of me, pulling me out of the cosmic nightmare and back into reality. Suddenly, I was gasping for air, coughing violently as smoke filled my lungs. I was back in front of my house, my burning house. EMTs rushed toward me, their hands grabbing my shoulders, pulling me onto a gurney. "You okay, buddy?" one of them asked, shining a light into my eyes. "Can you tell me your name?" I stammered out my name, barely able to form the words. My mind was reeling, still trying to process what had just happened. Then she asked me the year. 2020, I croaked. The EMT's face tightened with concern. She exchanged a look with her partner, who came over and whispered something I couldn't hear. "Do you know where you are?" the other EMT asked, a note of worry creeping into his voice. I blinked, confused. "Yeah, that's my house," I said, coughing. "Okay, we're going to get you to the ER, all right? We'll need to run some tests," he said, signaling to the others. I passed out before they loaded me into the ambulance, my mind swirling with everything I had just seen. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctors were already waiting for me. They said I was fine, no signs of brain damage or trauma. But when the doctor asked me the year again, I gave the same answer, 2020. I repeated. The doctor's face grew serious. "Son, it's 2024. For years had passed, for years gone, just like that. It wasn't possible, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Time in that house didn't follow the rules of the real world. While I had only spent a few days in there, for years had slipped by outside. My mom had passed away during that time. My brother, who had never given up hope, was there when I woke up. He'd aged more than I had. It was a cruel twist of fate. I looked exactly the same as the day I disappeared, while the stress of my absence had visibly aged him. As for Jasper, well, he's gone. No trace of him left, not even in the records. I tried looking him up, but the only mention of him I could find was a brief article about his suspected involvement in a mob hit the house. It burned to the ground, and the gatekeeper, I don't know why it spared me and incinerated Jasper. Maybe it was karma, or maybe there's no reason at all. Either way, I survived. But I'm not sure if I'll ever feel like I truly escaped. Up in central Pennsylvania, a little ways east of State College, there's an old railroad station in the town of Sen. Do not, under any circumstances, go there. Calling it a railroad station is generous. It's an ancient, rotting shack next to some long-forgotten tracks, with a trash heap 30 feet off in the woods. I first heard about it from urban explorers online. It's not haunted, there are no ghost stories or unsolved mysteries, just an old, decaying relic of Pennsylvania's past. The town of Sen barely even exists. It's a post office, a grocery store, and maybe 13 houses within a mile. The kind of place you pass through without noticing. I had no intention of going there, but I was already in the area. My dad and I were visiting Penn State, my top college pick, and staying in a hotel nearby for a few days. On Saturday, my dad left early for Pittsburgh with an old friend, leaving me with the car and time to kill. Somehow, I convinced myself it would be worth checking out Sen Station. A walk in the woods. If nothing else, the internet was full of cryptic warnings about the place. "It'll twist you inside and leave you spinning," one user wrote. But I figure it was just another overhyped location. maybe a secret hangout for locals. The drive was only about an hour and a half. By the time I got to Sen, I was speeding down empty roads lined with trees just beginning to turn copper for the fall. The station itself was hard to find, hidden among trees with no clear path leading to it. Eventually, I spotted a sign peeking through the woods and followed the tracks to Sen Station. It was exactly what I expected. Dilapidated tracks and a wooden shack filled with old junk. I explored for a bit, found nothing of interest, and decided to leave. But then I remembered something the online forums mentioned. A trash pile not far from the station. Maybe I'd find an old bottle or coin to make the trip worthwhile. The trash heap wasn't hard to find. It was just a mound of old junk bottles, cans, and random debris. I sifted through it, picking out a few bottle caps and glasses as souvenirs. Just as I was about to leave, the pile shifted beneath me. My heart raced as I panicked, thinking I had destabilized it and would fall into a heap of sharp debris. But after a few tense moments, nothing happened. Curiously, I threw a small rock at the pile. It shifted again, this time more deliberately. It started to breathe. The trash heap expanded and contracted, groaning and clanking like some mechanical beast. A rusty brown liquid oozed from its cracks, staining the ground around it. I was frozen, my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Eventually, I stumbled back toward the station and sat on its decaying steps, my eyes glued to the heap. It wasn't moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was alive, waiting. In my pocket, the bottle caps I'd taken started to jangle. I reached down, only to find them squirming like insects in my hand. They clung to my skin, twisting and writhing, cutting into me as they crawled up my arm. One by one, I ripped them off, but each one took a piece of my skin with it as it scurried back toward the pile. By the time they were all gone, my arm was slick with the same oily liquid that had oozed from the trash heap. For what felt like hours, I sat in silence, the forest unnervingly still. No birds, no whine, just the memory of the clanking heap echoing in my ears. I finally made my way back to the car, my hands still slick with the strange oil. The entire drive back to the hotel was a nightmare. The steering wheel felt wrong, like it was pulsing beneath my grip. The seat belt tightened around my chest, constricting with every breath. By the time I was halfway back, the car itself had begun to breathe, the heartbeat of the trash pile echoing through the cabin. I swerved off the road, crashing through trees and stopping in a patch of woods. I barely made it out of the car before it sealed itself shut with a sickening squelch. The oily liquid clung to the doors, the seats, the dashboard. The last thing I heard as I ran was the car groaning behind me, alive in a way metal and plastic should never be. Back at the hotel, I scrubbed my skin raw, but the oily residue still clings to my thoughts, as if the trash heap had seeped into my mind. I'm writing this because I need to warn someone. Don't go to Sen Station. There's nothing for you there, nothing but terror. The comfortable gaming chair I sat in was one of those high-end ones, sleek and red, providing a stark contrast to the deep, stone-gray walls of the room. The matte black table in front of me was minimalist yet elegant, something I could see myself purchasing if I ever had the chance. The ambience reminded me of those fleeting summer storms back home in the South, where the sky darkens for just a short time before revealing the familiar, sticky blue. I looked around the room, trying to calm my nerves. Shelby and Kyle sat across from me, both preparing for the live stream. Shelby had this quiet, unassuming presence, with her green eyes that sparkled like the grass after a rain, and her hair, a natural blonde that caught the light perfectly. Kyle, on the other hand, seemed far more animated, his excitement visible in the way he fussed over his microphone and smoothed his Sid Vicious t-shirt, trying to impress likely Shelby. It was easy to notice their dynamic even before the stream began. "Everything good on your end, Chuck?" Kyle asked, directing the question to the guy handling the tech behind the scenes. Chuck, with his thinning red hair and tired eyes, was perched behind a laptop, typing away as if the world depended on it. "Yeah, we're good. Just finishing up a few things here," Chuck replied, his voice barely audible over the clatter of his keyboard. Shelby smiled at me, warm and inviting, her voice soft as she said, "Claire, are you ready to tell your story?" I took a deep breath, nerves prickling at my skin. "Yeah," I managed, trying to convince myself as much as them. Kyle clapped his hands together. "This one's gonna be great. It'll definitely put our channel on the map." Shelby shot him a look, and I could tell she wasn't about to let Kyle's ambitions take over the show. "Let's let Claire tell her story the way she wants to," she said gently. "Right, of course," Kyle said, nodding. "I'm just excited, you know. This is huge." I shifted in my chair, the anticipation thick in the air. Chuck was still typing away, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his screen. I felt like I was on the edge of something monumental, but terrifying. This would be the first time I'd ever told my story publicly. The weight of it all began to settle on my shoulders. "Ready?" Chuck asked, pausing his rapid keystrokes for a moment to stretch. Kyle gave me a thumbs up, and Shelby's eyes asked me if I was truly okay. I nodded again, more confidently this time. "All right then," Chuck said, "we go live in 3.1. The silence that followed felt crushing, like the world held its breath. Then Kyle's voice broke through, chipper and professional. "Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Sinister Southern Stories, where we dive into all things spooky below the Mason-Dixon line. I'm Kyle." "And I'm Shelby," she added smoothly, her voice a calm counterbalance to Kyle's enthusiasm. "Today, we have an incredibly special guest with us. Claire Lamb has graciously agreed to share her story, one you won't want to miss." "Thanks for joining us, Claire," Kyle said, turning to me, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the wave of nausea that suddenly hit me. "Thanks for having me," I said, till my voice cracked slightly under the weight of my nerves. "Let's start with a little about you, Claire," Kyle said, leaning forward, eager for the details. "You're from Tennessee, right?" "Yeah," I replied, my voice low though steady. "I grew up in a small town, and I'm the only survivor of a death cult." Kyle and Shelby exchanged a glance before Kyle asked, "The Black Chapel, right? Can you tell us a little about that?" I nodded, images of the chapel flashing in my mind, as vivid as if I were standing before it. "We called ourselves the Black Chapel because that's where we met. It was an old, run-down chapel painted completely black, inside and out. There were only 15 of us." "15?" Shelby asked, her voice gentle but probing. "And you're the only one who survived?" "Yes," I said, feeling a familiar tightening in my chest. 13 of them died that night in the chapel, the 14th. He was shot outside. The tension in the room spiked as Kyle leaned in, his face full of anticipation. "Who shot him?" "My Uncle Earl," I said, the words sticking in my throat. "He was the most trusted among us. Father Arallo told him to do." Shelby's voice cut through the heavy silence. "Father Arallo was the leader of the cult, correct?" I nodded, my mind filling with the image of the man who had controlled our lives. "Yes, his real name was Thomas Purcell, but we called him Father Arallo. He believed he was an ancient sorcerer, centuries old, Before Kyle could respond, Chuck's voice interrupted, sounding tense. UH? Guys, ... The chat's reporting some weird hissing in the audio. The three of us turned to Chuck, confusion spreading through the room. What do you mean, hissing? Kyle asked, fiddling with his microphone. Chuck furrowed his brow as he clicked through his laptop. It's hard to explain, but one user described it as sounding like a walkie-talkie underwater. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Is it something with our equipment? Shelby asked. I'm not sure, Chuck said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. But it's getting louder. A crackle erupted from the speakers, followed by a deep, distorted voice. It wasn't human. The noise filled the room, chilling us all to the bone. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice trembling. Kyle leaned in, his eyes wide. What the hell was that? The room was filled with an oppressive silence for what felt like an eternity. Then suddenly it stopped. Chuck stared at his screen, bewildered. It's gone now. We sat there in stunned silence before Kyle broke it. Well, okay, let's keep going, he said, though his usual bravado seemed shaken. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the lingering dread. Uncle Earl ... He shot Sherry outside the chapel. That's when everything fell apart. Kyle's excitement was palpable, even as the strangeness of the moment lingered. Why did he shoot her? Because Father Aurala told him he had to, I said, the knot in my stomach tightening again. He said it was part of the ritual. The room felt colder, heavier. A strange, nagging feeling began to creep over me, but I pushed it aside. I had to finish this. I had to tell my story, no matter what. How did it unravel? Kyle pressed, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and dread. I took a deep breath, my mind snapping back to that night as vividly as if I was living it again. Sherry's face, twisted in fear, turned sharply towards the door of the chapel. Her hurried footsteps clattered against the worn wooden floor as she bolted. Earl's face was a mask of disbelief as he watched his wife, the love of his life, rush out into the dark night. Earl shot her once, I started, my voice breaking slightly as I relived the terror of it all. But she kept running. He shot her again, and the sound she made. I've never heard anything like it. She screamed so loud. Somebody from the road must have heard it, too. That's when the sheriff's department got involved. Kyle leaned forward, clearly captivated by every word. Where were you when all of this was happening? I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the cool wood beneath my back, the restraints cutting into my wrists and ankles, and the eerie calm in Father Aralu's eyes as everything around us descended into madness. I was tied to the altar, bound. While he carved these into me, I held up my wrist, showing them the jagged symbols etched into my skin scars that had never fully healed. No matter how many years passed. Jesus, Kyle muttered. He waved his cameraman over. Chuck, can we get a close-up on that? There was a silence in the room as I held out my wrist. The camera zoomed in on the old scars, capturing the horrifying truth etched in my flesh. Kyle cleared his throat, trying to maintain professionalism despite the tension hanging in the air. What happened after that? Earl came back, I said, feeling the bile rise in my throat. He and Father Aralu stood there, humming some strange, ancient hymn in perfect harmony. They put their hands on my head, chanting. We couldn't just let Sherry ruin everything. The ritual had to be completed. Why not? She was dead, wasn't she? Shelby asked, her voice soft but trembling. Because I reply, my voice hollow. It only happens once every 100 years. Shelby. Kyle was leaning forward in his chair again, eyes wide with disbelief. What does the ritual involve? Blood and sacrifice, I said flatly as I lay on the altar. I saw them take knives to their own throats. They kept chanting, even as their blood spilled out, soaking the floor below. Kyle looked like he was going to be sick. Have you ever heard someone chant with their throat cut open? Kyle shook his head, too stunned to speak. It's like a gurgling sound, I continued. They lose control of their voice, and eventually they just fall. But the chanting never stops. Everyone in the room sat in stunned silence. Kyle looked down, clearly grappling with what to ask next. After a long pause, Shelby spoke up. How did you survive? I don't know, I admitted. Two deputies showed up. They busted through the chapel doors and shone their flashlights right into Father Iralu's eyes. And what happened next? Shelby's voice was barely more than a whisper. They shot him. I remember his blood hitting my face. Right before he died, he whispered something. Kyle leaned forward, hanging on every word. What did he say? I swallowed hard. That we would all live again. Through the dark, blessed child, a long silence followed my words. Kyle's face had gone pale, and Shelby looked like she might burst into tears at any second. So that's when you blacked out? Shelby asked, her voice shaking. Yes, when I woke up, it was all over. The deputies untied me, and the place was crawling with police. Kyle, visibly shaken, tried to steady himself. Did you ever meet those deputies again? The ones who saved you? I shook my head. No, they died not long after. Kyle's brows furrowed in confusion. Hal, the one who shot Father Iralu. Deputy Miller, he died in a hunting accident. His friend shot him in the exact same spot on his head, and the other one, Deputy Parker, he was hit by a car during a routine traffic stop. Kyle seemed visibly disturbed by the news, his fingers typing furiously on his laptop. That's wild. Both deputies dead so soon after saving you. I could feel something shifting in the air. My head started pounding, and a high-pitched ringing began echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder. I winced, noticing Shelby and Kyle exchanging worried glances. The room had gone unnervingly quiet, save for the faint ringing. My chest tightened, the sensation building like a vice around my lungs. Are you okay, Claire? Kyle asked cautiously. He glanced at the camera nervously. This is what you wanted to share, right? I opened my mouth to respond, but instead something cold and unsettling came out. It doesn't matter what happens with your show, Kyle, I whispered, the words dripping with venom. She's never going to fuck you. Both Shelby and Kyle froze in place, eyes wide in shock. They exchanged a glance before Shelby's voice broke the silence. Excuse me. But before anyone could react, the sound of retching echoed from behind the camera. Chuck, the cameraman, was vomiting violently onto the floor, his face pale and twisted in horror. Chuck, are you okay? Shelby cried out, rushing over to help, but Chuck kept vomiting, his entire body convulsing. Chuck, what's going on? Tits her face. He screamed, pointing at his laptop screen. Look at it. Shelby and Kyle turned towards their own screens, and I watched as their faces contorted in disbelief and fear. Kyle stammered, holy shit. I felt something stir inside me, something sinister and uncontrollable. What's wrong with my face? I asked, unable to stop the twisted smile spreading across my lips. Kyle backed away from the table, terror flooding his expression. Shelby's laptop turned towards me. My reflection stared back at me, my skin a sickly greenish-gray, melting like wax in a flame. The flesh dripped down my face, revealing something far darker beneath. Oh, so the camera can see the truth now, I whispered, a cold laugh escaping my lips. I leaned in towards the camera, grinning. Well then, I guess it's time to end this. Claire, what's happening? Shelby cried out, her voice cracking with fear as Kyle rushed to put more distance between us. I stretched, my bones cracking with each movement as I stood up. Claire isn't here anymore. We're all here now. Hundreds of us, the room fell silent, save for the frantic typing of viewers in the live stream chat, each desperate for an explanation of the horror they were witnessing. "What do you want?" Kyle screamed as I slowly approached them, each step a sickening crack of bone and joint. I reached for Chuck's laptop, my blooded hand trailing across the keys, the symbols on my wrist oozing with thick, dark liquid. "We want you all to join us," I whispered, pressing the screen closed, ending the stream. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where people wave at you as they walk their dogs, and everything feels safe. But about 6 months ago, things began to change. It started with footsteps. Every night just after midnight, I'd hear them faint at first, like someone walking outside. I told myself it was just animals or late-night passers-by, but it didn't take long for me to realize something was wrong. The footsteps weren't outside, they were inside my house. I live alone, so it made no sense. Lying in bed, I could hear soft, deliberate steps moving through the hallway just outside my bedroom. Sometimes they stopped right at my door. I'd hold my breath, expecting it to creak open, but it never did. Every night I checked, and every night nothing. No signs of a break-in, windows locked, everything just as I had left it. But still the footsteps continued. Then things started moving. I'd wake up to find my bedroom door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it. The chairs in the kitchen would be just a bit out of place, or the cabinet doors would be left open. It was subtle, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I decided to install cameras, one in the hallway, one in the living room, and another by the front door. For weeks the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. Everything appeared as normal as ever, until one night I woke up to the familiar sound of footsteps. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and checked the live feed. At first, it looked like any other night, but then I saw it. In the hallway, the camera picked up a shadow, something or someone moving just out of the camera's view. It wasn't clear, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The figure walked toward my bedroom door, but the door never opened. The shadow just stood there for a moment, lingering, before slowly retreating into the darkness. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called the police. I explained that someone had been inside my home, but once again there were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. And then things got worse. I'd wake up to find my phone unlocked, random apps open like someone had been using it while I slept. Sometimes there were messages I didn't remember sending. One night I was startled to wake by the sound of heavy breathing, but it wasn't mine. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and opened the camera feed. That's when I noticed something chilling. The camera in my bedroom, which was always pointed toward the door, was now facing me. Someone had turned it while I was sleeping. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag that night and went to stay with a friend. For weeks I avoided the house, too scared to return. Eventually I decided to sell it. There was no way I could live there, knowing someone or something had been inside, watching me. Before leaving for good, I reviewed the footage one last time. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. 2 weeks before I left, the hallway camera captured something unmistakable. A man, dressed in dark clothing, casually walking down my hallway. He wasn't trying to hide. When he reached my bedroom door, he stopped, turned to the camera, and smiled. Then, without hesitation, he opened the door and walked into my bedroom. But here's the part that still haunts me. He never came out. I could still feel the soft pressure of Molly's hand on my cheek as we entered the first room. a sensation that felt oddly out of place, given the unsettling vibe the escape game was trying to convey. The door clicked shut behind us with a heavy thud, and the air immediately felt colder, staler. The room itself was dimly lit, just enough for us to make out our surroundings. Old, rusted tools hung on the walls, with a single flickering light bulb swinging from the ceiling. A battered workbench sat in the middle of the room, covered in dusty, tattered blueprints and scattered, unidentifiable objects. A chalkboard was propped up on one wall, strange symbols scribbled in white all over it. "All right, let's get started," Tony said, clapping his hands together. He was always the one to take charge, even in something as trivial as an escape room. Stella stayed by the door, her arms wrapped around herself. I could feel her discomfort, the tension between us hanging in the air like a thick fog. Ellie, ever the optimist, immediately started inspecting the workbench, her brow furrowed in concentration. I tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering back to Stella. How could everything have gone so wrong? A shrill screech suddenly echoed through the room, making us all jump. It came from the chalkboard. Tony was running his fingers over the symbols, trying to figure out if they were a clue. "What do you guys think this means?" he asked, looking back at us. Before anyone could answer, the dim light flickered out, plunging us into complete darkness. For a moment, none of us moved, the sudden shift in atmosphere paralyzing us. Then, just as suddenly, the light flickered back on, but this time something was different. The workbench, once covered in random objects, now had something else on it. A photograph. I walked over to it, my heart pounding, and picked it up. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of Stella and me from years ago. We were standing by the river near campus, smiling, arms around each other. A moment from a lifetime ago, before everything fell apart. "What the hell?" I muttered, turning the photo over. There was something written on the back in red ink. "You cannot escape the past." I showed it to Tony, Ellie, and Stella, who looked just as confused as I felt. "Is this part of the game?" Ellie asked, her voice shaky. "I don't think so," Stella whispered, her eyes wide. Suddenly, the door leading to the next room creaked open on its own. A cold draft swept into the room, making the small hairs on my arms stand on end. We all exchanged uneasy glances, but Tony, ever the brave one, stepped forward. "All right, I guess that's our cue." As we stepped into the second room, my stomach dropped. It was an exact replica of my old college dorm room. The posters on the wall, the small, cluttered desk, the bed with the faded quilted was all there. Even the scent of cheap laundry detergent and old textbooks hung in the air. My chest tightened with a sickening sense of déjà vu. "Guys, this is not part of the game," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tony and Ellie looked at me, clearly confused. "What do you mean? This is your old room." "Yeah," I muttered, my eyes scanning every inch of the room. It was too real, too personal. How could this be here? Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. The light in the room flickered again, and the shadows seemed to stretch and distort, creeping along the walls like tendrils. Then I heard it, a soft, familiar voice, whispering in my ear, sending a chill down my spine. "You should have stayed with me." I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the oppressive silence and the suffocating weight of memories I had spent years trying to bury. Stella was staring at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing down, suffocating me with the weight of the past. "Look," Ellie shouted, pointing at the desk. There, written in the same red ink as before, was a single sentence. You cannot run from what you've left behind. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This wasn't a game anymore. This was something else. Something dark and twisted that had somehow followed me here. From the life I thought I had escaped. Tony was at the door, banging on it, trying to get it open. "This isn't funny. Let us out," he yelled. But the door didn't budge. Stella's voice broke the tense silence. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that whatever this was, it was something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. We were trapped, not just in this escape room, but in the tangled mess of my own regrets, my past mistakes coming back to haunt me in the most literal sense. And the worst part, I had no idea how to get up. I rushed over to Tony, my heart pounding in my chest, as he lay there, motionless. His face was bruised, swollen, his breath shallow and ragged. "Tony, man, come on. We gotta get out of here," I whispered, but he didn't respond. Stella came over, tears welling up in her eyes as she knelt beside him, gently touching his shoulder. "Tony, please get up," she pleaded softly. Ellie stood at a distance, shaking, her face pale and streaked with tears. She hadn't moved since hearing about Andrew. Her mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely, lost in the revelation that had unraveled in front of us all. "We can't stay here," I urged. The door to the second room stood ominously open, as if waiting to consume us. There was no telling what would happen if we didn't move. Tony stirred, his voice a broken whisper. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His eyes were glazed over, distant, like he wasn't even here with us anymore. "Tony, it's not real, okay?" None of that was real. Stella tried to reason with him, but we all knew what we'd seen. Real or not, the impact was undeniable. "Come on, man," I said, gripping his arm and pulling him to his feet. He was weak, but he stood, swaying like a broken doll. Ellie said nothing as she wiped away her tears, the shock still evident on her face. She glanced at Tony, her eyes a mix of pain and confusion, but didn't make a move to approach him. We made our way through the open door, hesitant and scared of what awaited us in the next room. Second room was smaller, but even more disturbing. It had an antique, almost Victorian style to it, with dark, ornate wallpaper and heavy velvet drapes that covered non-existent windows. There was a single chair in the center of the room, surrounded by small, creepy dolls dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their glassy eyes staring blankly at us. In the middle of the room sat an old phonograph, its horn twisted and tarnished. The moment we all stepped inside, the door behind us slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing all of us to jump. The countdown appeared once again. This time, we had 20 minutes. Suddenly, the phonograph crackled to life. A haunting, distorted voice began to play through it. Double quotes SS. Welcome. To the second room. To move forward, one must sit and confront the truth. Only then will you find your way out. Or be trapped forever. Asterisk. The dolls seemed to shift slightly, their heads turning ever so subtly toward us, as if they were waiting, watching. Stella and I exchanged a glance. "What the hell does that mean?" she whispered. "I don't know, but I'm guessing one of us has to sit in that chair," I reply, eyeing it warily. Tony, barely able to stand, slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged and his face pale. He wasn't in any shape to participate in whatever twisted game this was. I glanced at Ellie, but she didn't look like she could handle much more either. "I'll do it," Stella said suddenly, stepping forward. "Wait. No, we don't know what'll happen. I'll do it," she repeated, her voice firm but trembling. She gave me a look that told me there was no point arguing. Reluctantly, I nodded. She walked slowly toward the chair, each step feeling like a countdown to something horrible. As she sat down, the phonograph clicked again, the voice returning, more menacing now. To move on, you must confess. Tell us the one thing you've never told anyone, the secret that haunts you the most. If you lie, you will pay the price. Stella's face went pale, and she gripped the sides of the chair. What the hell is this? She muttered under her breath. I don't know, I said. Maybe you don't have to do this. Maybe we can find another way. The dolls around the room began to twitch, their tiny limbs jerking unnaturally. One of them fell off a shelf, crashing to the floor with a hollow sound. Stella, just say something, I urged, panic rising in my chest. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling. I've never told anyone this, she began, her voice shaky. But the night I left for my new job, Suddenly the dolls moved again, this time closer, their tiny feet scraping across the floor in unison. Stella, hurry up, I shouted. I kissed Andrew, she blurted out, her voice breaking. The night before I left, we were drunk, and I kissed him. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to happen. But it did, and I've hated myself for it ever since. The room fell silent. The phonograph crackled once more, and the voice spoke again. Thank you for your honesty. Proceed. The dolls stopped moving. The door to the next room creaked open. Stella stood up, her face flushed, tears in her eyes. She didn't look at me or Tony or Ellie as she walked toward the door. None of us said a word as we followed her into the third room, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging heavily in the air. The clock on the wall of Rosie's diner ticked steadily, its hands inching closer to the end of another night shift. Pine Hollow was a small, sleepy town where everything slowed down after dark. By 3 a.m. the streets were empty, and the hum of the diner's refrigerator and the occasional click of a coffee cup were my only companions. I'd worked the night shift at Rosie's for almost a year. Most nights the quiet was comforting, a time for reflection. But tonight something felt different. The air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. The kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. I wiped down the last table, and that's when I heard it, a faint, mournful whistle, far off but unmistakable. I paused mid-wipe and listened. The whistle grew louder, closer. A shiver ran down my spine. It was the sound of a train. But there were no tracks in Pine Hollow. The nearest line was miles away. I walked to the window and peered out. The street was as empty as always, lit only by a flickering street lamp. But the whistle continued, followed by the faint chug of an engine and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. My heart raced. There were no trains here. This was impossible. Stepping outside, the cool night air hit my face as I scanned the deserted street. The sound of the train grew louder, its whistle echoing through the quiet town. And then, as the clock struck 3:15 a.m., I saw it, a ghostly train, emerge from the darkness, its form hazy and distorted like a mirage. It looked ancient, its steam engine churning, the cars illuminated by an eerie blue light. I stood frozen, watching as it passed by Rosie's diner. The train's whistle sounded again, a lonely, wailing cry that seemed to pierce the night. A strange force tugged at me. I felt a compulsion to follow the train, to board it, but I fought the urge. The train slowed down, its doors creaking open, revealing a shadowy interior. My feet began to move toward it, as if pulled by an invisible force. But before I could take another step, the train roared back to life. The doors slammed shut, and it picked up speed, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had come. I stood there, trembling, my heart racing. The street was silent once again, but I knew what I had seen, And it wasn't just a trick of my mind. The phantom train was real. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory. The eerie whistle, the ghostly train, it replayed in my head over and over. I tried to focus on work, but every time the clock neared 3 a.m., my dread grew. By the time my shift ended that night, I was on edge, expecting the train to return, and it did. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the whistle echoed through the night once more. I rushed to the window, and there it was, the same ghostly train, rolling down the street as if the tracks ran right through town. The pull to follow was stronger this time, almost unbearable. The doors of the train creaked open again, beckoning me to board. I stepped outside, my feet carrying me toward the train, despite my mind screaming to stop. The train slowed down, waiting, the dark interior seeming to call to me, but this time I resisted. I stood firm, watching as the train lingered for a moment, then vanished into the night, leaving me standing in the empty street. I couldn't keep doing this. I knew the train would return, and each time the pull would grow stronger. I needed answers. The next morning, I started asking around town. Pine Hollow was small. Surely someone had heard of this train. But when I mentioned it to the locals, they just looked at me like I was crazy. No one had ever heard of a train running through the town. Frustrated, I went to the town's library. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian, greeted me with a smile. I asked her if she knew anything about an old railroad line or a train that used to run through Pine Hollow. She frowned, thinking for a moment, then led me to a back room filled with dusty records and old newspaper clippings. There was never a train line here, she said, but we do have some old documents from the early 1900s. Maybe there's something in there. I sifted through the papers, and then I found an old article from 1912 titled Tragedy at Pine Hollow Station. The article described a train accident during the construction of a small station on the outskirts of town. The station was part of a rail line that was supposed to connect Pine Hollow to neighboring towns. But before the line was completed, a train derailed, killing everyone on board. The project was abandoned, and the half-finished station was left to decay. My heart raced as I read the details. Could this be the same train? Was the phantom train somehow tied to this century-old tragedy? I had to see for myself. That night I drove to the site of the old station. The building was long gone, replaced by overgrown woods and crumbling stone. But as I stood there in the darkness, I felt it, the same pull, the same compulsion that had drawn me to the train. The whistle sounded again, faint but unmistakable. And then, out of the mist, the phantom train appeared once more, its ghostly form shimmering in the moonlight. This time I didn't move. I stood my ground, watching as the train rolled past me. The doors opened, but I stayed where I was, resisting the call. The train lingered for a moment, and then, with a final mournful whistle, it disappeared into the night, leaving only silence in its wake. I never saw the phantom train again, but its memory haunts me. Pine Hollow may have forgotten the tragedy of that long-ago derailment, but I never will. The ghostly train had come for me twice, and I knew that if I had boarded, I wouldn't have come back. The phantom train of Pine Hollow was real, and I had come dangerously close to becoming one of its passengers. The morning after that fateful night, I sat at Rosie's diner, staring blankly at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of me. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind: the train, the crash, the haunting figures of the passengers, and the overwhelming sadness that had gripped me in those final moments. The pull was gone, but the memories remained. Rosie, the owner of the diner, noticed my distraction. "You all right, hon?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, But the truth was far darker than anything Rosie could imagine. I had not only seen ghosts, but I had ridden with them. "I'm fine," I reply, though the words felt hollow. I wasn't fine, not after what I had witnessed, but I knew I couldn't tell Rosie or anyone else in Pine Hollow what had happened. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, what could they do about it? The phantom train was gone, its journey complete, and the spirits that had haunted it were finally at rest. But as I sat there staring out the window at the empty streets of Pine Hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that the town still held secrets. The train may have been at peace, but something told me that the tragedy of 1912 wasn't the only dark chapter in Pine Hollow's history. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the accident, the passengers, and the eerie pull that had drawn me into the train. I kept asking myself the same question: why me? Why had the train appeared to me and not to anyone else in town? My thoughts kept returning to that small plaque in the clearing near the old station. "Their spirits shall forever ride the rails," it had said. I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story than what I had seen. Determined to find answers, I returned to the library. Mrs. Henderson greeted me with a warm smile. But this time, I wasn't here for casual research. I wanted the truth back again. "Dear?" she asked, her voice light with curiosity. "Yeah, there's more I need to know," I said. "Anything about Pine Hollow's past ghost stories and explained events? Anything strange that's happened in the town's history?" Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Well, Pine Hollow has its fair share of legends," she said thoughtfully. "Though I can't say I've ever heard of anything quite like what you're describing." I followed her to the back room again, where she pulled out more dusty files and old books. As I flipped through them, one story after another came to light, tales of strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and ghost sightings that had plagued the town over the decades. But none of them mentioned the phantom train or the accident at the station. Then, buried beneath a stack of old newspapers, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a faded article from 1913, the year after the train accident. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Linked to Abandoned Station." According to the article, several people had gone missing in the months following the accident. Locals who had been seen near the old station but had never returned home. The authorities had searched the area, but there was no sign of the missing. The article went on to describe how some believed the spirits of the train passengers were responsible, luring the living into their ghostly realm. I stared at the article, my heart pounding. Could this be what the train had wanted from me? To claim me as one of its own, just like those who had disappeared over a century ago. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but there was something else in the article that caught my eye. A name I hadn't expected to see. My great-grandfather, Samuel. According to the article, Samuel had been one of the people who had gone missing near the station. He had worked on the construction of the railway and had vanished just days before the train accident. His disappearance had been dismissed as a tragic accident, and no one had connected it to the phantom train until now. The pieces were starting to fall into place. My connection to the train wasn't just a random occurrence. It was tied to my family's history. The train had come for me because of Samuel, because of the unfinished business that had haunted my family for generations. I had to know more. I left the library in a daze, my mind racing. If Samuel had been one of the train's victims, was it possible that his spirit was still out there, bound to the tracks like the others? And if so, was there a way to free him? The only way to find out was to go back to the clearing, back to the ruins of the station, back to the place where it had all begun. That night I returned to the outskirts of Pine Hollow, to the clearing where the remnants of the station lay hidden beneath the trees. The air was thick with mist, just like before, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the ground. I approached the spot where I had found the plaque, my heart pounding in my chest. The pull was back, stronger than ever, urging me toward the tracks, but this time I wasn't afraid. I was ready to face whatever awaited me. As I stood there, the air around me grew colder, and the familiar sound of the train's whistle echoed through the trees. The ground beneath me rumbled, and I knew the train was coming. But this time something was different. As the train materialized out of the mist, I saw figures standing on the platform, ghostly figures dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and drawn. Among them was a man I recognized from an old family photo. Samuel. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him, my great-grandfather, standing there among the dead. His eyes met mine, and I could see the pain and sorrow etched into his ghostly features. He had been trapped here for over a century, bound to the phantom train. Unable to move on, I took a step forward, the pull stronger than ever. But this time, I wasn't being drawn into the train. I was being drawn to Samuel. "Samuel," I whisper, my voice barely audible. "I'm here to help you." His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. The other ghost seemed to fade into the background as Samuel stepped forward, his hand outstretched. The train's whistle blew again, louder this time, and the pull intensified. I felt as though I was being torn in two. Part of me wanted to reach out to Samuel to free him from his torment, but another part of me wanted to run, to escape the pull of the train before it was too late. From a young age, I knew I wanted to work with animals. My father's allergy was a constant disappointment, so we never had pets at home. In high school, I toured with various career options: zoologist, horse trainer, or even a professor hunting for undiscovered species. But a solid veterinary program at my state school seemed like the perfect fit, so I went for it. I grew up in a small, tranquil town where everyone knew each other. The sole veterinary clinic there was a family-owned business with a tight grip on the market. Despite the friendly atmosphere, the low wages and lack of advancement opportunities left me itching for a change. I didn't want to leave my roots behind, though, so I explored alternative veterinary paths. One option was home euthanasia services. It's a tough job bringing a vet to a pet's last moments in the comfort of their home, rather than in a sterile, frightening clinic. Many vets burn out quickly from this role, but I needed the job, and the money was good. So I took it. For a while, everything went smoothly. I handled several appointments daily, bought a condo downtown, and started to dream of opening my own practice to compete with the family-owned clinic. Then came one Christmas Eve. It was unusual to get an appointment during the holidays, but there it was, an urgent call for 6 p.m. on the edge of town with minimal details. The animal was a dog, and the account was under the name Mr. Gawker, flagged in red. This was unusual. I called my manager, who seemed unusually jittery. She hinted at past issues with this account, but wouldn't elaborate. Her nervousness made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off and headed to the appointment. Mr. Goucher's house was isolated, situated far beyond the city's edge, past the last gas station. The long, dark driveway led to a dilapidated house, obscured by unkempt branches and cluttered with trash. It looked abandoned. I assumed the flagged account had something to do with the house's condition. The man who answered the door was a tall, gaunt figure in tattered black clothing, adorned with an Egyptian neck. His face, streaked with smeared makeup, was reminiscent of a decayed rock star. He barely greeted me, only gesturing me inside. The interior was unsettling. Runes and symbols covered the walls, and the air was rank. I hesitated, but pressed on, following him into a room with windows covered by black trash bags. The walls were plastered with disturbing artwork, dark figures with burning red eyes. Then I saw the dog, a beautiful black puppy, about a year old. Despite the grim surroundings, the dog was friendly, with a healthy, glossy coat and an affectionate nature. I was relieved to see such a well-cared-for animal in such a place. "What's his name?" I asked. The man just shook his head. "What's wrong with him?" I probed. The man's only response was a strange, wet noise that sounded like a laugh. The dog, oblivious to the tension, nuzzled my leg. I examined the puppy and found him to be in excellent health. "I can't perform euthanasia on a healthy animal," I explained. "It goes against my oath." The man's eyes were cold and filled with malice. I felt a surge of protectiveness for the dog, but there were no signs of abuse or neglect. The dog was well fed and seemed content. "Despite the surroundings, I'm leaving," I declared, my resolve firm. I was tempted to take the dog, but something held me back. I didn't want to risk the man's wrath. As I made my way out, I felt a shiver down my spine. The man's presence loomed behind me, making my skin crawl. Once outside, I saw him staring at me with a look of terror. I spent Christmas with my family, trying to forget the unsettling visit. On New Year's Day, I drove past Mr. Goucher's house on my way back from a friend's party. My curiosity got the better of me. Police cars surrounded the house, and officers moved about in somber silence. A detective, looking pale and shaken, informed me that Mr. Goucher had been killed by what appeared to be a large animal, possibly a wolf, though wolves don't typically attack humans indoors. The detective had no clue about the black dog. Days later, I began seeing pairs of fiery red eyes in the dark. They appeared behind my condo, by the dumpster at the local tavern, and near the river where a homeless man slept. It was unnerving. That night, after a late appointment, I returned to my condo to find it strangely quiet. The familiar scent of dog hit me hard. A pair of fiery red eyes materialized in my bedroom. I felt paralyzed with fear as the massive, black beast approached. I couldn't move. I shut my eyes, my heart racing, and fled, just in time to hear the door splinter behind me. I left that night, abandoning my condo and job. I crashed with friends and eventually moved to a big city, where I took up a new job as a delivery driver. It wasn't ideal, but it kept me away from animals and the shadows of my past. A few months later, I returned to my hometown. Everything seemed normal, except for the unsettling number of people now walking dogs, black dogs, each with those haunting red eyes. I've moved on, but the terror of that night never fades. I left veterinary medicine behind and live alone, far from the darkness of that old house. I don't know why Mr. Goucher couldn't put down the dog himself, or why the dog seemed to haunt me, but I'm sure of one thing: some shadows are better left undisturbed. My husband had always dreamt of having a dog. I wasn't particularly fond of dogs, but after years of his persistent requests, I finally agreed. We were both thrilled, taking a day off work to visit the local shelter and find the perfect companion. After a few visits, we chose a small dog, barely a few pounds, whose previous owners had recently passed away. I was content, but my husband was overjoyed. The initial months were a challenge, as expected with a new pet. Establishing a routine for Coconut, the name we finally settled on after much deliberation, was tough, but the joy she brought into our lives was undeniable. It wasn't until we had Coconut for a few months that something unusual happened. A few days ago, while my husband was at work, I called Coconut for her lunch. Normally, she would rush to her food bowl, but this time she didn't come immediately. After searching her usual hiding spots and growing increasingly anxious, I finally saw her slowly making her way to the bowl. I was relieved, but noticed something odd. She was eating her food unusually slowly, and there was a white object stuck on her harness. It took some effort to remove it, but it appeared to be a feather. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it might have come from a torn pillow or something similar. I forgot about the feather until yesterday, when we were replanting our flower bed. While clearing out weeds and dead flowers, we encountered a terrible smell, as if something had died. My husband started digging deeper to locate the source of the odor, and eventually discover what looked like a dead goose buried in the soil. The sight was baffling. How could a goose end up buried in our flower bed? Our backyard was securely fenced, and we hadn't touched it in months. I felt a chill run down my spine. Without turning around, I asked my husband what color the goose was. His puzzled response of white only confirmed my fears. My mind raced with unsettling thoughts. The feather on Coconut, the dead goose, there had to be a connection. I ran inside, hyperventilating, and blurted out my theory to my husband. He laughed it off, calling me paranoid and insisting that Coconut, our sweet dog, couldn't possibly harm another animal. Despite my protests, he argued that we should wait until morning to take her to the vet and suggested she sleep in her crate in the living room for the night. I felt uneasy, but reluctantly agreed. When my husband went to put Coconut in her crate, I stayed in the bedroom. After 20 minutes, without a sign of him, I became worried. Instead of going downstairs, I checked our old pet camera app, feeling a surge of dread. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. I debated for a few minutes before dialing 911. The police arrived, and I explained through tears that something had broken into our home, and my husband had gone downstairs to investigate, but didn't return. They found his body and concluded it was likely a wild animal attack, given that we lived in bear country. They suggested I stay at a nearby hotel and promised to contact me the next morning. As I sit in the hotel room, watching the footage over and over, I am haunted by what I saw. I had removed the camera before the police arrived, fearing they wouldn't believe me. The footage revealed a chilling scene. My husband lying on the floor, blood pooling around him, while Coconut savaged his neck. The most terrifying part was when Coconut stopped and locked eyes with the camera, her gaze unnervingly focused. Her eyes were glowing red, an ominous sign, a warning, or perhaps a promise. Even now, as I look out the hotel room window, I can see those same red eyes watching me from the shadows. A chill ran down my spine as I stood frozen at the entrance of the bathroom, my breath catching in my throat. The memory of that childhood encounter still haunted me, even though it had been years since I had seen her. Her face twisted and sickly, her fingers outstretched, clawing for me. It was a nightmare that never truly went away. I had told myself 1,000 times it wasn't real, just the imagination of a scared child. But every flicker of the bathroom light, every shadow that stretched across the hallway at night, reminded me that something was out there. Lorelei. The voice echoed in my mind, scratchy, almost inaudible, yet unmistakable. I hadn't heard it in years, but tonight the weight of that name felt heavier than ever. I closed the bathroom door firmly behind me, the soft hum of the light now steady. Anthony lay fast asleep in the bed, unaware of the tension in the air. As I crawled into bed beside him, my body felt rigid, my mind racing. I hadn't told Anthony about the woman I saw all those years ago. It was my burden to bear, and, truth be told, I wasn't sure he'd believe me. I barely believed it myself anymore. But every time that light flickered, every time I caught a glimpse of something moving in the dark when it shouldn't have been, the faint sound of scratching pierced the silence of the night. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly I sat up, straining my ears. There it was again, faint, but deliberate, coming from the direction of the bathroom. A soft, rhythmic drag across the wood of the door. No, I thought, not again. Not now. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if she knew I was awake, listening. The sound of her nail dragging across the bathroom door was unmistakable, and I could already feel the icy presence behind it, waiting for me to make the same mistake I had as a child. Lorelei. The whisper was closer this time, the voice raspier, more demanding. My heart pounded in my chest, and I clutched the blanket tighter, as if it could shield me from whatever was waiting in the darkness. I glanced over at Anthony, still oblivious, lost in the depths of sleep. I envied him for not knowing the terror creeping just outside our bedroom door. I closed my eyes tightly, willing the sound to stop, begging for it to go away. But it didn't. The scratching continued, slow and methodical, like she was playing with me, waiting for me to come closer, just like before. Lorelei. My breath hitched. This time I swear I could hear her right outside the bedroom. The bathroom light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, making everything feel more suffocating. I forced myself to open my eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to move, not even an inch. The flickering stopped. For a brief, merciful moment, the house fell silent again, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, the faintest sliver of light from under the bedroom door, and beneath that light, feet, pale, unmoving feet, standing just outside the door. I gripped the sheets tighter, terror clawing at my chest, my body refusing to move. The feet remained still for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, they shifted, and I heard it again, her nail, slowly dragging down the door. Lorelei. My name lingered in the air, chilling me to the bone. This time, I didn't run to my parents. There was no safety on the other side of the room. There was only her, and I had no idea how much longer I could keep her out. If you're ever in New York, steer clear of Cogstein Apartments. Trust me, no amount of cheap rent is worth what I went through there. I moved in thinking it would be a good starting point for life in the city, but I had no idea I was walking into a nightmare. It started innocently enough. I'd only been there about a week when I first saw her. At first glance, I thought she was just another lost soul in the city, maybe someone down on their luck. I didn't think much of it. People keep to themselves here, and it's usually best to do the same. But the more I saw her, the more I realized she was different. She wasn't lost. She was something much worse. The first time I encountered her, I was heading back to my apartment late at night. My place, 701, was at the end of this long, monotonous hallway that felt more like a prison than a home. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on everything. I remember feeling the usual weight of loneliness as I walked toward my door, but that night it was replaced by something else, fear. She was standing at the window at the far end of the hallway, her long black hair covering her face. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there staring down at the street below. I didn't want to interact, but I felt compelled to say something, if only to break the unsettling silence. "Hello?" I asked, stepping a little closer. No response. "Are you okay?" I pressed, inching nearer, still nothing. She just kept staring, her face hidden beneath that tangled mass of hair. She was wearing this white dress, but it was filthy, covered in smudges and stains. Her hands, though they were what caught my attention, they looked old, weathered, like they belonged to someone decades older than the rest of her body. I was already regretting getting involved, so I awkwardly said, "Well, if you need anything, I am in 701. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard it jump. The voice was soft, but it echoed in my mind, clear and undeniable. I froze, but she didn't move. The word reverberated in my head, though, like it was coming from her, not from her mouth, but from inside my skull. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and hurried inside, slamming it shut behind me. My girlfriend, Sarah, came out of the bedroom, her usual irritation giving way to concern. "What's wrong with you?" I told her about the woman in the hallway. She rolled her eyes, accusing me of making it up, or worse, trying to hide something. Was she hot? Is that what this is about? "Sarah, seriously, I'm telling the truth," I insisted, pointing toward the door. "Go look for yourself." She stormed over to the peephole, but when she looked through it, she turned back to me, more pissed than before. "There's nothing there, Daniel. You're losing it." I rushed over, looking through the peephole myself. But there was nothing, just the dark hallway and the window beyond. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was out there, waiting. The voice stayed with me. "Jump." It would pop into my head at random moments, its presence as real as the air I breathed. The days passed, and I didn't see her again, but the memory of that first encounter festered. It was like she'd planted something in me, a seed of dread that grew every time I closed my eyes. Sarah and I fought constantly after that, her frustration, with my growing paranoia adding fuel to the fire. One night, after an especially bad argument, I stormed out, needing to cool off. I headed for the elevator, but when the doors opened, there she was again, standing in the corner. Her back was to me, just like before, her filthy dress hanging limply on her frame. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. "Why are you here?" I muttered, more to myself than to her. No response. I reached out, unable to stop myself, and touched her shoulder. Her skin was ice cold, like touching dry ice, and I jerked my hand back in pain. The word rang through my mind again, "jump," but louder this time, more insistent. My legs felt heavy, my thoughts clouded by the overpowering urge to obey. The elevator doors opened, and I stumbled out, my heart racing. I glanced back, but she was still there, standing motionless as the doors closed behind her. A few days later, I was carrying a piece of furniture down the stairs when I saw her again. This time she was standing on the landing above me, her back still turned, but closer now. I tried to ignore her, thinking if I just kept going, she'd leave me alone. But I couldn't stop myself from looking back as I reached the bottom of the stairs. She was there, right behind me. "Jump." The command echoed in my mind, and before I knew it, I was following her back up the stairs, my body moving against my will. She led me all the way up to the roof, where the wind howled, and the city spread out below us like a vast, uncaring ocean. I was standing on the ledge before I even realized it, the void below calling to me. Her voice filled my mind, a siren song I couldn't resist. I was ready to step off when I heard Sarah's voice behind me. "Daniel, what the hell are you doing?" The spell broke. I snapped out of it, stumbling back from the edge. But Sarah ... She didn't stop. She walked past me, her eyes fixed on the woman. And in that moment, I knew what was about to happen, and I couldn't stop it. Sarah stepped off the edge. After the funeral, I left New York for good. I moved back in with my mom, far away from the city and its ghosts. But even now, late at night, I can still hear that voice. It whispers to me in the dark, reminding me of what I saw. When my little brother Jerry got married, I was asked to step in as a bridesmaid for his wife-to-be. The guest list was a little thin on the bride's side, and he figured it'd be a good bonding experience. His fiancée, Susie, came from a small rural community in Minnesota and didn't have much family. Jerry briefly mentioned that she was an orphan and that it was an off-limits topic to bring up. Not that I planned to. Susie and Jerry met during his studies at MSU and had been together for over 6 years before they decided to make it official. These were the people who were practically married already. On their wedding day, I did my best to cater to Susie's needs. She seemed a bit down, but I figured it was just cold feet. I didn't want to pressure her, so I held my tongue and observed. There were little things that stood out: the way she sighed at her reflection, the way her eyes sunk when she saw the flower arrangements. She didn't say anything, but her face had this subtle discontent. As we waited for the dress, I found her pouting on an ottoman outside the bathroom. I sat beside her and gave her a curious look. "It's all beautiful," I assured her. "I can tell you put a lot of thought into it. It's not a big deal." She smiled. "But it's not perfect. Nothing is, but you know, I get it." I nodded. "Nothing's perfect. It's not that. It's like," she turned, facing me with a furrowed brow, "nothing is really, truly beautiful. It's all right, but nothing is like I want it to be. What would you change if you had more time?" I asked. "That's just it," she groaned. "I have no idea. It's just a feeling, you know." There were a couple of surprises for Susie, though. Jerry had gone out of his way to make her happy. He tracked down her mother's wedding dress, which had been auctioned off when her family's estate was sold to pay for her education. He even made a bridal bouquet from the bright pink flowers that grew in the backyard of her childhood home. These were surprises, but he had backups in case she didn't like them. When the dress arrived, Susie had a strange expression. Recognition, disbelief, amazement all rolled into one. She smiled and twirled around the room, hugging the dress like an old friend. She stared at herself in the mirror, smiling. "It's not perfect, but it's getting there," she said. "It's almost like I pictured it. I feel it." I handed her the bridal bouquet. Watching the pink petals reflect in her eyes, "I really do feel it. Right here." She placed a hand on her stomach, smiling from ear to ear. The ceremony was beautiful. The walk down the aisle, the exchanging of vows, the first dance. They left the church to a rendition of Tom Jones' Chills and Fever. But I couldn't help glancing at Susie. I caught her staring at her reflection several times. She hesitated to throw the bouquet, seemingly mesmerized by the pink petals. A couple of weeks passed, and life moved on. I forgot about Susie's odd behavior until Jerry called me. We met at a cafe, and I noticed something off. He was trying to keep a brave face, but his hands trembled, and he seemed exhausted. He didn't take long to dive into the real reason for our meeting. "I want to talk about the wedding," he said. "Did Susie say anything when she saw that dress?" "She loved it," I said, chewing on my sandwich. "Really loved it?" "Yeah, but did she say anything strange?" "She mentioned it not being perfect, but getting there." "Getting there?" Jerry repeated, his brow furrowing. Turns out their honeymoon hadn't been as magical as they'd hoped. Susie had been obsessing over the wedding dress all week. She'd even cried in the bathroom, saying she wouldn't get another chance to wear it. She said it made her feel beautiful, Jerry explained, and how rare that was. He let her do whatever she wanted. even wear the dress all day. But it was getting out of hand. She'd started sleeping in it, and when they returned home, things got worse. "She's scaring me," Jerry admitted. Susie began making modifications to the dress, hand-weaving blue threads and accessorizing herself to match some idealized version of beauty she had in mind. Jerry had to stop her from tattooing her face and even from cutting herself. Then Jerry stopped responding altogether. I went to check on him and found their home surrounded by police. Jerry hugged me like he was holding on for dear life and told me what had happened. Susie had completely snapped. She'd torn out chunks of her hair, stained her mouth with dirt, and tried to staple her ears to her head. That's when Jerry stepped in. Things had gone from bad to worse, but then the pain intensified. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the visions seared into my mind. I couldn't stop looking at it, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn away. It was like watching the sun too much, too close, too bright but impossible to escape. Jerry was screaming now, sobbing into his hands, and Susie stood there, arms outstretched, embracing whatever horror was descending upon her. She was grinning, her broken teeth glistening in the moonlight, her body trembling with excitement or madness. I couldn't tell they loved me, she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "I'm becoming one of them." The thing reached her, though I could barely describe what it was. It wasn't flesh, but it moved like a body. It wasn't shadow, but it twisted like darkness. Its form rippled and shimmered, pieces of it folding into itself like it was trying to become something new. I saw it extend something, a hand or a limb, or maybe just a thought, toward Susie. She giggled like a child, tilting her head back, letting it touch her. Her skin rippled where it made contact. It shimmered like the fabric of the dress had when it caught fire. The same metallic sheen spread over her body, her bones creaking as her arms stretched unnaturally long, her fingers elongating into sharp, jagged points. She moaned with pleasure, her voice echoing unnaturally across the field. I forced myself to look away, gasping for breath. To think it wasn't just changing her, it was consuming her, twisting her into something else, something not human. And yet, she wanted it. She welcomed it. "Jerry," I screamed, reaching out to him. "We have to go." But he couldn't hear me. He was lost in his own terror, unable to process what was happening. Susie's transformation was almost complete now. Her once human form had become something monstrous, her limbs too long, her skin too pale, her eyes wide and glowing with unnatural light. She looked at me one last time, that horrible grin still on her face, and whispered, "Come with us." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I grabbed Jerry's arm, pulling him to his feet. We ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't bear to see what Susie had become or what was following us. The thing, whatever it was still there. I could feel it, even though I couldn't see it. It was watching, waiting.